Hey, what's up? It's Cute What If this side. Today we will be seeing, what if Deku and Katsuki were on house arrest? Now before we move ahead with the fic, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for future what ifs like this. One had only just settled into dorm life when the two people at the heart of the class got into their fight. Deku Katsuki and Midoriya Izuku were now under house arrest for both breaking curfew and getting into a fight. Needless to say, the class was stunned by the development, never thinking either would break the rules so flagrantly, though for different reasons. Say what you like about Deku Katsuki, that he was brash, rude, and had a temper. But he never broke rules once established. As for Midoriya Izuku, the soft-spoken, gentle and kind soul that most of the class knew him to be would never dream to attack a fellow student. So, of course, even though they were forbidden to ask, they were burning with curiosity. And so, it was to this situation that Izuku's seemingly multiversal bad luck introduced itself. Izuku had just walked out to take out the trash and was coming around the corner as another UA student, this one in the general studies uniform, bumped into him and sneezed. This would have been written off normally if there hadn't been a bright flash of light that swallowed up the class's cinnamon roll. Izuku, of course at this point desensitized to being hit unexpectedly by quirks due to the near-constant stream of villain attacks since the beginning of the year, just pulled out his phone, asked the other student some questions and called Aizawa as he walked back into the dorms, making what he said next audible to those inside the common rooms. That's right, Aizawa-sensei, the quirk is called Honest Touch. It seems that if the holder touches someone, then they can cause the target to answer any questions honestly and voluntarily. He stopped, blinking as his eyes slightly lost focus. No, Aizawa-sensei, my quirk is not problem-attracting, it is one for all. There was a PRGNT pause as everyone in the common rooms froze, looking at Izuku shocked, learning that his quirk was, apparently, not called superpower. No, Aizawa-sensei, that was a cover story All Might came up with after he gave me his quirk. At this point everyone was about to jump Izuku to demand answers when Deku came sprinting down the stairs, charging right at Izuku, only to be stopped by Ada, who whispered a quiet reprimand to the explosive blonde. Deku, I understand how you feel, but it is rude to interrupt a phone call. In response to another question, Zombie Izuku said All Might said we had to hide the truth because it would be more dangerous for others to know about it. Another pause as Aizawa, seemingly forgetting that Izuku could have been anywhere in the campus at that moment, thus telling an apparently national-level secret, asked another question. No, I honestly don't think the advice is still valid since we know that All for One is still alive, as he has known about it for a long time. The answer caused the other students in the room's BLD to turn to ice. All for One is the Kamino word villain. Everyone knew who that was, everyone had seen that fight. Then Aizawa-sensei asked the question he probably should have asked from the beginning, though he probably, admittedly understandably, was too shocked to do so. I'm in the common room of the dorms. No, everyone else is here. Izuku's disturbingly emotionless eyes scanned everyone's faces, evidently taking note of the shell-shocked expressions they all wore, and simply said, it is safe to assume they all know, yes. Izuku pulled the phone away from his ear as a loud crashing could be heard from the other end of the phone, and Aizawa's voice could be heard as the phone automatically went to speaker. Stay right where you are. Problem child. Don't move a muscle. At that point, Izuku's eyes regained focus, and he looked around again as the phone line cut off. He took in the stares that everyone was leveling at him. Izuku said the only thing that could have made the situation worse, in a voice that was half pleading, half resigned. Please tell me Aizawa didn't ask about Aldra. Shouta. Aizawa rarely panicked. It was illogical, counterproductive, and a waste of energy. Today, Shouta felt his panicking was completely justified. Not only had he accidentally uncovered a national-level secret, he had accidentally done it in such a way that an entire class of high school-aged children had also been brought in on the secret. He vaulted over a low hedge, also clearing the low, brick, retaining wall on the other side as well without breaking stride. Not only did he have to immediately call All Might and let him know about the quirk-induced spilling of said secret, he rolled bellow movers carrying for a couch, probably a replacement for one of the general education dorms. The lack of DSBLN allowed for the non-heroic course students frequently boggled the mind. No, none of that was apparently enough for whatever cosmic entity that steered their lives. Because, due to protocol, he had tuned his communicator to pick up the audio from the security cameras in the communal area that Midoriya had apparently been in when he dropped that series of bombs, so that he could make sure he tracked the fallout of such a reveal now that functionally everyone knew about the secret. But apparently, Midoriya wasn't done dropping bombs today. As Shouta was dialing up All Might, he heard Problem Child say, please tell me Aizawa didn't ask about Aldra. So, here Aizawa was, having already been bolting out of his office as he called All Might. He unfortunately didn't even make it out of the faculty offices when the situation got even worse. He started swearing in earnest when he heard the voice of Kendo Itsuka come over the comms at the same time Kaminari asked the question that made things more complicated. He had heard the doors open and Kendo say, hey, yeah Momo, I brought everyone for the study session like you asked. At the same time Kaminari asked Midoriya, what's Aldra? Then he heard the monotone response that seemed to indicate the quirk taking effect. Hell on earth. At that point Kirishima asked Deku a question that sent ice through Shouta's veins. Bekubro, wasn't Aldra the name of the middle SH school you and Midoriya went to? And Shouda's mind raced as he called up all the details about the two troublemakers in his class on a wrist-mounted computer that he stole glances at as he ran, as Bakugo loudly and angrily brushed Kirishima off and stormed off to his room. Bakugo Katsuki, high grades, pristine record. All notes on file from educators sung his praises as a model student, cheerful and amicable. Shouda stumbles at the blatant discrepancy already blatantly in place between what was recorded and the reality of the student that was placed under his care. With dread pooling in his stomach, he pulled up Midoriya's record. Midoriya Izuku, mediocre grades, black marks and infractions a mile wide. All reports were universally scathing, near venomous in nature. Wrathful, manipulative, venomous and vindictive in his jealousy of other students. Shouda's heart froze, then it started to boil with unmitigated rage as he put the pieces together. The school had doctored the files, and given what he knew now, he could see why they had done it. Not that he agreed, in fact he was disgusted even more, now that he understood. Bakugo was undeniably powerful, so the school clearly swept any misbehaviors under the rug in the hopes of being able to brag that they had helped teach a top pro hero. Meanwhile Midoriya, and then it fully CLC-ked for Shouda. Midoriya Izuku was quirkless before he had gotten one for all from All Might. And, almost against his will, Shouda started to remember the horror stories about the treatment quirkless people received. And given how much rarer being quirkless was with each passing generation, by the time Midoriya had been born, at most 5% of his generation had been born quirkless. And then Shouda heard the questions start, and he hated to admit it. But he slowed down curiosity, taking control over his sense of decency, and longing to prevent Midoriya from being taken advantage of while he was vulnerable under the influence of the quirk. Midoriya bro, what was Aldra like? Like it can't have been that bad, right? Shouda could hear the desperation in Siro's voice, and he knew. Siro had known someone quirkless. He knew how they were treated, probably firsthand. And further, Siro had put the pieces together too. He knew what his classmate was going to say, even if he didn't want to believe it. The answer nearly broke Shouda. Imagine the kindest teacher there was Aizawa-sensei after he had decided that you had no potential, and then got told by Nezu that he couldn't expel you. Then Monoma Nito interrupted, sneering at Midoriya. Oh, what's happened here? I wasn't aware we were called here to listen in on the sordid past. What happened? Midoriya got hit with the truth quirk, and are admitting to the students you bullied in middle school. Shouda started to pick up speed again. Clearly, he had failed Midoriya categorically. And as much as he wanted to blame All Might and Midoriya for not telling him from the beginning, if he had read the files he would have known already. It wouldn't have been strong to uncover at the time. Then all that would have been left would have been to confront All Might. But, no, none of that mattered other than explaining Midoriya's behavior since the quirk apprehension tests. Shouda had lost Midoriya's trust, probably the exact moment he told him he would never be a hero. Having said that, as soon as he saw Monoma, he was going to plant his boots so far up the prickly blondes but it would be visible out of his mouth. Then he was going after Khan. As Aizawa was musing about how he was going to tear Class 1B's chief antagonist to pieces in revenge for Izuku, said green-haired boy was continuing to rock the worldview of his fellow heroics course students. Turning to Monoma, Izuku barely acknowledged him before turning to Siro once again, resuming his answer to Siro's question. Since, before All Might gave me one for all, I was genetically quirkless. Oh, and if that revelation didn't rock the poor green prisoners' audience to their core. I was at the bottom of the social ladder. And at Aldra that was all the teachers needed to give all of the quirked students license to freely use their quirks on me however they saw fit. Then Izuku proceeded to list everything that was done to him during his time in middle school. From simple quirk-enhanced beatings, to being baited with fake love letters that led him to be beaten by larger groups, to the meant being participated in by said teachers, and even treatment that was just shy of war crimes by the pre-quirk definition. But what had everyone in Class 1 furious was how prominently Bakugo Katsuki featured in the list of wrongs done to Izuku. But the real bomb had yet to be dropped. Kaminari, clearing his throat, flinching under the glares of his classmates who just wanted the nightmare of what they were learning to end. He steeled his resolve and asked Izuku the question he hoped would shift the mood of the class. After all, Izuku himself said that All Might had given his quirk to him. Midoriya, can you tell us about the day you met All Might, and the day he gave you his quirk? The electric blonde asked, unaware of the fact that he was dooming both Bakugo and All Might. Izuku just numbly nods his head, before he continued recounting his middle school days with Bakugo Katsuki's last and most DMN offense. Yes, though those are two separate days. I met All Might less than an hour after Kakin told me, if you want to be a hero so bad, there might actually be a way to do it. Take a swan dive off the roof and pray for a quirk in the next life. Everyone in the room froze. Each and every one other than Izuku, who was mercifully unaware of the questions or answers being traded, felt their hearts freeze, and the girls felt their hearts break only to feel rage boil to the surface. But Class 1A's inhumanly kind, forgiving, and friendly nightmarishly abused puppet M wasn't done telling his about how he met All Might just yet. In fact, it was just beginning. I was lost in thought as I walked under an underpass on my way home, when a sludge villain appeared behind me, though I didn't notice them until they were trying to drown me so they could use me as a meat suit to try to escape All Might. Horrified gasps filled the room, as a teary-eyed Uraraka Ochako ran over and hugged Izuku to her as she wept into his shirt. Emotionlessly he continued. I was blacking out from lack of oxygen when All Might arrived, then he launched a smash into the underpass at the villain, knocking us both out. I honestly don't think he noticed me until the sludge villain dispersed from the force of his punch. When I woke up, All Might had signed my notebook, and was about to jump away to take the sludge villain to the police. So, in an act of desperation I rushed forward and latched onto his leg. By the time he noticed we were above the city skyline, which he promptly forgot as he tried to force me off his leg until I pointed out that I would die if he succeeded. Ochako gasped as she heard what he had done. Clinging tighter to her friend, she glared up at him, pouting angrily, ignoring the fact that he obviously wasn't aware of his surroundings as he continued. So, we landed on the roof, and I asked All Might the question I had been dying to ask him, should I ever get the chance. I told him I was quirkless, and I asked him if someone like me could ever hope to be a hero who could make people feel safe with a smile like him. Everyone held their breaths as they waited for All Might's answer, though obviously he had to say yes if he gave high. He showed me an injury that had been about 5 years old at that point and told me that because of it he could only be a hero for about 3 hours a day. Then he told me no, he did not think that someone quirkless could be a hero. He told me that it was fine to dream, but that I should be more realistic. You could have heard a pin drop if anyone was in the mindset to perform such an experiment at that time. All Might, the hero who said anyone could be a hero, told Midoriya, mother of Sea King Izuku, who was probably the most heroic person ever, that he couldn't be a hero. And then, he left. Izuku's voice shook a bit, as it was clear even through the dampening effect of the quirk. This was an emotionally charged moment of his life, and everything everyone had ever said to me started to echo in my head. Every voice that told me to give up on my dream, and it culminated in Kaken and Bakugo's suggestion. It struck everyone who knew the two that Izuku had stopped using his nickname for Bakugo. Izuku cut his lips and continued the story. It's almost funny, really, right as I was considering taking Bakugo's advice, his explosion snaps me out of it. At that moment, the sound of a loud explosion powerful enough that I felt it a few blocks away on the top of a building that wasn't close to the ground by any stretch of the imagination. And I started running towards the sound, as had been my habit back then, to try and find out who was on the scene and maybe take some notes on the quirk of whichever villain was there, when I remembered All Might's words, and I stopped. Some of the more academically inclined students pondered on the notes Izuku mentioned, having never heard of or seen anything like he was describing, before they were once again distracted alongside everyone else by having their hearts clench in sympathy for the boy in front of them being forced to divulge his deepest secrets, and his astonishingly tragic past. Yaoyorozu Momo had her hands over her mouth, tears streaming from her eyes, slowly shaking her head as she listened to his words as if by doing so she could make them stop, or become untrue, even though she knew, like everyone else, Izuku couldn't lie right now. Eventually I made my way down to the ground level and started walking in the direction I had thought would take me home. However, it seemed that in my emotional turmoil, I had walked to the scene of the villain attack. I figured since I was already there I might as well take a closer look, for the notes I could take on the fight, even if it turned out to be my last entry. Kirishima felt an electric thrill course through his body in recognition as he heard what was said next. Looking up, I saw that the villain causing havoc was the sludge villain that All Might had saved me from earlier. So, naturally, I blamed myself for their escape. Even worse, I heard that they had taken a hostage. And in that moment, I felt it to my core. Undeniable proof of what All Might had told me. I could never be a hero. In fact, in that moment I was as far from a hero imaginable as I was responsible for the horrific mess taking place in front of me. So, full of guilt, I begged the hostage to hold on in my mind, as surely pro-heroes would save them soon. Almost everyone listened with bated breath, wondering which pro would swoop in and save the day. But Kirishima's eyes widened as he began to connect the dots. He remembered the incident, since it was that incident that helped push him to become a hero. Except, there were already pro-heroes on the scene, and none of them were doing anything to save the hostage. While, admittedly, Kamui Woods was getting bystanders out of the danger area, and Backdraft was trying to put out the fires the hostage's quirk were causing. Most of the rest were just standing around shouting about how their quirk was a bad matchup to fight the villain, even Death Arms, ignoring the fact that he could easily at least pull the hostage away from the sludge villain. And then I saw the hostage was Bakugo. And suddenly everyone stilled, and even the religiously devout Ibara would admit, although ashamedly, that for a moment they hoped that no one would come to save him. But then they remembered. They remembered not only Izuku's story up to that point, but the fact that the explosive blonde was still with them, even if he was holed up in his room upstairs, and they knew. They knew who the hero that swooped in to save him was. And that just made them feel even more conflicted. I was shocked, and then he looked me in the eyes. And I saw the fear as he ran out of breath. And the next thing I knew, I was past the blockade, past the idling pro-heroes, and charging towards the sludge villain. And then I remembered my notes on Kamui Woods, and the principles of his super move. So, I analyzed my enemy and noticed that even though a majority of their body was fluid, their eyes and teeth seemed to be solid. So I threw my backpack into their eye, and started to try to dig Bakugo out of the villain while they were stunned. Unfortunately, even in all that time, even after the villain's weakness was exposed, no one came to help, and at that time I hadn't been hitting the gym. So, before I was able to get Bakugo out, the villain recovered and reared back, intent on crushing me into the ground. The girls let out involuntary strangled cries at this. But then, suddenly All Might appeared, and blew the sludge villain away. Afterwards, he was swamped by press, and Bakugo and I were surrounded by pro-heroes. While some of them were singing Bakugo's praises, like everyone else. The others, like Kamui Woods, Mount Lady, and Death Arms chewed me out for being reckless. Death Arms even going so far as to claim that there was no reason for what I did and asked if I had a death wish. All of the students bristled at this, especially in light of Death Arms' own inactivity in spite of how blatantly dire Bakugo's condition was. Afterwards I was released and was walking home when Bakugo confronted me. He claimed that he didn't need my help, and that he didn't owe me anything before storming off. This earned some scornful scoffs. Then as I turned around to continue my way home, All Might burst out of an alleyway, and stopped in front of me. He apologized for what he had said earlier and said that I could be a hero. And then, he offered me his quirk. Taking a deep breath, Izuku continued. However, due to the nature of his quirk, I had to train to build up my muscle mass to be able to have even a prayer to withstand the force of his quirk. And so, it wasn't until after 10 months of training, 3 hours before the UA entrance exam, that All Might began the process that gave me his quirk. Ochako stared at him in awe, before realizing something. Wait, you said began the process, when did you get access to the quirk? She demanded, dreading the answer. Izuku looked right into her eyes, as he said simply, the first moment I felt access to One for All was when I heard you call for help, as the zero-pointer was bringing down its foot on top of you. That was my first time using One for All. Shouta was rooted to the spot, tear tracks on his face as he hid in his capture weapon almost on impulse. The revelations from Midoriya were upsetting, to say the least. And that was after years of seeing some of the most heinous crimes imaginable, hardening Shouta to how cruel humans could be to each other. Hell, Midoriya wouldn't have even been the first child he had seen who had suffered discrimination for being quirkless. But this was different, somehow. This wasn't hearing reports of cruelty delivered tiredly from an overworked detective or reading dispassionately stated evidence of harm from medical records. This was one of his students, and he was hearing it directly from their mouths in excruciating detail. No, it wasn't that either. Was it because it was Midoriya, the student who had proven time and again that he had potential? The student who showed that he would never stop trying to improve himself. No, that didn't fit either. Shouta pondered a bit longer as he forwarded the audio to Hound Dog absently, then at CLCCAD, and he swore again. The quirk that hit Midoriya forced the victim to answer any questions honestly and involuntarily. However, given what happened when Shouta had stopped asking questions and started running, with Midoriya asking a question that, had he been aware of the contents of his exchange with Shouta, he wouldn't have asked. A pit formed in Shouta's stomach as he realized that it was entirely possible that, under the influence of the quirk, Midoriya would have no memory of either the questions leveled at him, or the answers he had given in response. Upon realizing that particular piece of distressing news, Shouta dove into a dead sprint. He had to make it in time to prevent Midoriya from being forced to answer any further questions he wouldn't have wanted to answer had he been in control of his faculties. He saw the Heights Alliance dorms for his class come into view in the distance. He slowed slightly when he heard his phone ping. Looking down, he saw a message stating that Hound Dog was on his way, coupled with threats to All Might's health. When he heard Mina's voice trembling and thick with emotion stutter out a question, clearly trying to lift the mood. Mina cleared her throat, trying to get her voice to work as she fought back the tears and the guilt almost boiling over. Might worry, at least it seems to that why you found a crush, eh? Izuku shrugged, his eyes still vacant as he turned his distressingly emotionless eyes on her. I guess. Not that it matters, though. Her heart fell apart at that, rendering her unable to respond. Thankfully Kyoyuka hadn't lost her ability to speak, and was clearly upset by that answer, an ember of protective anger on Ochako's behalf surfacing through the empathetic grief for Izuku she was probably feeling as well. What's that supposed to mean, Green? The purple-haired girl demanded, shooting a teary ghost of a glare his way. Izuku's response shattered whatever had held the rest of the girls in place throughout his story. No one could ever love someone as defenseless, stupid, worthless, miserable, clumsy, and weak like me. With a collective wail, all of the girls in the room surged forward, clinging to any part of Izuku's torso or arms they could reach, soaking both Izuku and each other in their tears. Whether they were clinging to him out of budding feelings for the boy, or just to find comfort in confirming the boy's continued existence, none of them were quite sure in that moment. If any of them had been asked, however, each of them would say that it honestly didn't matter. What mattered was that Izuku was clearly not okay, no matter what he had told them before. As such, it was in this state that Shouta found Midoriya. Coming out of the quirk and question-induced stupor, blushing madly, looking at the girls clinging to him and sobbing in a mixture of confusion and concern, asking the girls what was wrong, only getting incoherent blubbering responses from them. Shouta sighed and called Midoriya's attention to himself. Midoriya, I need you to tell me how much you remember between when you got hit by that quirk and now. He sighed internally as he saw everyone tense at his words, the looks of guilt and horror flitting across their faces as they connected the dots for themselves. He was grateful that he had managed to draw Midoriya's attention away from them for the moment. The last thing he needed was for Midoriya to feel guilty for making his classmates feel guilty. Midoriya took his characteristic thinking pose, or at least, as close as he could without dislodging the clearly distraught girls hanging off of him, before shaking his head confirming Shouda's fears. "I'm sorry, Aizawa-sensei. I can't say I remember very much of anything other than you shouted at me to stay put." A look of horror crossed his face as he continued, looking back at his fellow heroics course students and at a barely audible whisper said, "And I begged everyone to tell me that you didn't ask about Aldera." Shouda's heart went out to the boy as he saw the hunted look in the child's eyes as Midoriya asked, "Sir, what did I say?" And so, Shouda played the entire event back for him. And by the end of it, Midoriya was in tears, his expression warring between fear and confusion. Fear, Shouda suspected, at the thought of betraying All Might, and the less than ideal past of both Midoriya and Bakugo coming to light. The confusion was probably at the fact that the response that he was clearly getting wasn't what he expected. Shouda sighed as he decided to cut off the boy's racing thoughts before they spiraled out of control into a full-blown panic attack. He reached out to the boy, pausing as the still sobbing mass of girls pulled Midoriya away, and the boys took an almost unconscious step to shield him, causing another blow to Shouda's confidence as a teacher. Had he really failed so badly that he was seen as a threat for his students to protect each other from? He shook his head. Now was not the time. "Midoriya, listen to me," he said, his tone firm, yet soothing, snapping the boy out of his train of thought. "It's going to be all right. It wasn't your fault that this happened." He held up a hand to forestall the otherwise inevitable contradictory arguments and self-deprecations that he knew now would be incoming. "Look around you and look carefully." He paused as Midoriya did so. "You're not in Aldera anymore, Midoriya. You have friends here, real friends that care about you." At this point Midoriya broke down and sobbed, and as he did so the boys joined the girls in hugging the boy as best as they could. Shouda sighed as he stood. Having said that, he sighed as all of the students tensed, Midoriya looking at him fearfully, and the other students giving him the stink eye. It's clear that what has come to light has heavily impacted everyone here. And I would be remiss if I do not remind you all that Hound Dog is a fully licensed therapist, and to encourage each of you to speak to him about what transpired and your feelings on the matter. He then leveled his gaze at Midoriya, pausing to make sure that the boy made eye contact with him. "However, Midoriya, you will have mandatory sessions with Hound Dog. You've been repressing a lot of pain and trauma, and that isn't healthy or productive. Trust me, it will negatively affect your performance in hero work, if it hasn't already." He has also received a copy of the recordings of what has transpired before I arrived, and he is waiting for you to report to his office. He felt guilty when he said that and saw Midoriya flinch, but it was a necessary evil. If self-interest hadn't been enough to get the boy to open up to someone about his experiences voluntarily, perhaps his sense of duty, coupled with the fact that the cat was already out of the bag, would encourage him to seek the help he so desperately needed. Midoriya nodded, hesitantly at first, but then after a moment more firmly, as the boys disengaged to allow him through as he started to shuffle forward, only to be pulled back again by the girls refusing to let go. This, of course, had the unintended effect of toppling the entire group of children as the problem child lost his balance and fell backwards. Shouda huffed a small laugh as the greenette turned beet red as he landed headfirst on Uraraka's breasts, as she had been the one clinging most tightly to him. As Takage, Shouda would swear it was intentionally, bumped Gyro face first into the boy's chest, drawing out a small squeak from both students. Deciding to be merciful, Shouda said, "However, that can wait, as it is clear that none of you are willing to let Midoriya out of your sight right now, and it is getting late. It was only 4 p.m. You may have a slumber party in the commons. Class 1B, I will get permission from Vlad King for this joint exercise, so feel free to get anything you might need and return here. Pizzas will be delivered by lunch rush in a couple of hours." He hid his smile as the students clamored with some excitement, a hint of their original energy peeking through in response to his clearly unexpected generosity. Normally he would quash this by reminding them that they had school the next day. But some massive information bombs had been dropped today, and none of them would probably be in a mental condition to focus on studies until everything had settled, so he instead said, "In light of the weight the revelations Midoriya has given us, school activities will be suspended until further notice as the faculty perform an in-depth investigation and a thorough discussion with All Might about the wisdom of withholding, and encouragement of withholding crucial information about quirks from the UA faculty, rendering us unable to properly provide guidance to one of our students." Normally the latter part would have been kept to himself, but he could tell by the vindictive glint in the eyes of his students that he had made the right choice in transparency. At the very least, it would prevent another incident like Ada's attempt on stain to be taken against the symbol of peace, even if Shouda secretly felt that All Might would deserve it. Nodding to himself, he turned, calling over his shoulder, "Enjoy your free time and do your best to strengthen your support each other during your break. But don't slack off with training. We can't have you falling behind the other school's hero courses, can we?" He chuckled as he heard the united chorus of assent behind him before schooling his expression into a much fiercer glare. Just because the students couldn't kick the symbol of peace's butt didn't mean he wouldn't. All Might was clearly long overdue for remedial lessons in what it means to be a hero. Yagi Toshinori was many things: a performer for the masses, a philanthropist, a loyal friend, a hardened veteran hero, just to name a few. Although he would be the first to admit that he was lacking when it came to being an educator, he was ashamed to admit that the lessons he had taught during the USJ hadn't been properly learned until after the Camino Ward incident. He had allowed his pride, and admittedly his fear, rule his life until he was forced into retirement abruptly by an ancient evil that he and his hubris had assumed dead. Fortunately, that same evil, known as All for One, had been captured and sent to Tartarus. And, while Toshinori in no way believed that he would stay there before his plans involving Shigaraki had reached fruition, he did believe that his influence was, at least temporarily, weakened enough to allow young Midoriya to build up a network of confidants himself. It was from these musings that he was interrupted by a link sent to him by Principal Nezu with the cryptic message, "It seems the matter was taken out of your hands, Toshinori. Come to my office once you are done watching, we have much to discuss." Bemused, Toshinori CLC'd on the link, blinking in surprise as it showed a security camera feed of the Heights Alliance Class 1 dorms, specifically focusing on the front door of the building from the interior. He blinked puzzled when he saw his protege enter the building on the phone with Aizawa reporting being hit with the quirk. Oh no. As young Midoriya finished detailing how the quirk worked, All Might Toshinori felt a pit forming in what remained of his stomach. His fears were immediately realized as Aizawa's usual snark accidentally uncovered a secret closely kept for almost 200 years. Well, it could be worse, at least it was only eyes. The entirety of Class 1 had been present for the revelation. Toshinori chuckled weakly. Surely it couldn't get any worse. Toshinori sighed to himself. Now 1B knew as well. It was fine. Toshinori could work with this, he could. And then Toshinori learned about young Midoriya's past, and he felt sick. Choking back sobs of his own inempathy and guilt, he got up to go to meet with Nezu. He needed a distraction. And then he heard it, the question that he knew would condemn him. In his own eyes, if not the eyes of his students. Toshinori tried to flee, but he couldn't move. As desperately as he tried to force his body to move, to escape, it wouldn't budge. And so, he heard the story, and it was worse than he had thought. He had taken a child who had just been told that the only way to accomplish their dream was to commit suicide, and he had essentially told them that their tormentors were right. And then, like a monster, he had abandoned that same child, who, on top of having his dream crushed by his idol, on top of being told to kill himself by someone who, by the boy's own later admission, had at one point been like a brother to him, something Toshinori was still present enough to admit he had no way of knowing without asking further. But what he had known was that the boy had almost King died. It was something that every hero knew, because it was taught as part of the basics of rescuing people. No one was emotionally stable after such a close brush with death, especially children. Toshinori ran his hands over his face, only half listening now, catching that the young boy he had failed that day had considered jumping. But at this point Toshinori was feeling a little numb. And then he heard the words that he had said to that boy, that young hero, after he dove into a situation where trained professionals hesitated. "Young man, you too can become a hero." Toshinori took a deep breath, flinching only slightly at the reminder of when exactly he had given young Midoriya one for all, and after making himself presentable, he strode quickly to Nezu's office. Nezu sipped his tea, thinking over how well his plan had worked to make sure Midoriya would have the support network he needed to succeed as a hero firmly in place. He thought over how he had secretly told Hound Dog about One for All, requesting that the school therapist not intervene until they at least had All for One behind bars, as well as to keep tabs on both All Might, and when he had been selected as the boys' homeroom teacher, Eraserhead. Unfortunately, Eraserhead's penchant for snap decisions and knee-jerk judgment calls, alongside his general apathy towards, well, if Nezu was being honest, everything, had caused more than their fair share of wrinkles in the plan. Even if no one knew exactly how severe his immediate call that Midoriya wasn't suited to be a hero, and even worse, telling the boy such would have been at the time. Anyone who had taken the time to read the boy's files, like any responsible educator for such a dangerous field of work should have done, would have known such judgments were not only unfounded and unfair, but severely detrimental to any trust being built between teacher and student. Something crucial for cooperation out in the field, or, as demonstrated less than a week later at the USJ, in emergencies. Of course, All Might's honestly concerning fear-mongering the next day about keeping the DMN Quirk secret from everybody hadn't helped things. He had clearly developed an unhealthy, almost fanatical mentality towards the thing, as well as the demands for secrecy the past holders had stressed. Something Nezu mused had probably played strongly into each of their demises, as unfortunate as they were. Not to mention All Might's own failure to actually confirm the kill on All for One all those years ago. And then there was the issue of Shigaraki's supposed actual identity. Nezu sighed. No, it was time this farce of secrecy came to an end now that All for One was behind bars. Regardless of his future escape, it was clear that much of his plans around securing One for All relied heavily on isolating the current wielder. Something Nezu supposed he would have to point out to the young ninth holder once the youth began private lessons with him. Unfortunately, it seems that the plan to force the reveal worked a little too well. Even Nezu hadn't been expecting all of what had come to light, especially not regarding young Mr. Bakugo. Something else that would need to be addressed. For now, he had faculty members to convince to take therapy themselves before they further damaged their careers as educators and their legacies as heroes. At that point in the principal's musings, he glanced down and saw Yagi approaching his door. Speak of the devil and he will come. Smiling fiercely, Nezu pressed a button to let the retired symbol of peace into his office. Shouta tried to keep himself calm as he walked away from the dorm buildings until he was sure he was out of line of sight of his students. But as soon as he thought he was clear, he relaxed for a moment, before he started storming back to the faculty offices to give All Might a piece of his mind. And then he was going to give proper thought to the appropriate punishment for Bakugo. Shouta silently seethed at the thought of the student. He was, even if begrudgingly, grateful that the explosive blonde had sequestered himself away in his room because Shouta wasn't sure he would have had the self-control to not punt the little Sid all the way off the school grounds. His thoughts were interrupted, however, when he heard heavy breathing and running footsteps approaching him from behind. Sighing and grumbling to himself, Shouta turned around only to be surprised to see Midoriya running up to him. Working his jaw, Shouta decided to get whatever new shitstorm Midoriya know. That wasn't fair to the kid. Whatever discussion Midoriya wanted to have out of the way so he could get back to avenging the kid. What do you want, Midoriya? Please don't be too strong on All Might or Kaken, Aizawa-sensei. Or not, Shouta sighed, silently frustrated at the kindness the boy showed at times. I can understand All Might somewhat, given how much of a fan of his you are, Midoriya. But why Bakugo? He held his breath, fighting all of his instincts to dismiss the kid out of hand as just being his usual, overly kind, overly forgiving self. He was surprised, however, when Midoriya shook his head and said, "That's not why I don't want you to be too strong on All Might, sir. The reason I don't want you to be too strong on him is because he was the only one who told me I could become a hero when I was quirkless. And if that wasn't a kick in the chest, what about your parents?" He didn't mean to ask the question, but he was thankful that the quirk's effects were apparently already wearing off, as Midoriya's eyes were only slightly duller than normal during this series of questions. But he had to know. Surely his parents weren't abusive on top of everything else. Midoriya's laugh was bitter as he shook his head again. My mother only told me that she was sorry, that she wished things could be different. My father abandoned us after my diagnosis. My mother tried to play it off as him working abroad, but she forgot to hide the paperwork. And yet again, Midoriya had managed to rock Shouta emotionally without even trying. Although, honestly, he shouldn't have been so shocked. As kind as Ms. Midoriya had seemed, she had seemed almost frantically overprotective even now that her son had a quirk the few times Shouta had met her. Then he heard something that really shook him. As for Kaken, I have evidence that at least some of his behavior might have been under duress. And with that, Midoriya played an audio clip that had Shouta seething all over again. But this time he had targets he knew not even Midoriya would protect, if the almost vicious fury he saw in the boy's eyes was any indication. I told you pressuring Bakugo to get rid of that quirkless brat would come back to haunt us. An unfamiliar voice, older and masculine, hissed. Well, I'm sorry, but who was it who threatened the brat's parents if he didn't manage to take care of the problem? A woman's voice, trembling with rage, hissed back. Both of you, enough. This voice, belonging to someone who was clearly unhealthy, wheezed. It doesn't matter who did what. What matters is that we've convinced both of those boys that no one would either believe them or care if they reported us. Thankfully, our contact in the police department was able to intervene when Bakugo tried to report what was being done to Midoriya back in elementary school. Well, what are we going to do now? The first speaker snarled. Absolutely nothing. The Weezer said, their voice dripping with oily confidence, his statement earning shocked murmurs from the other two. We back off, just enough to not be suspicious, and we let you take care of crushing the boy with a rejection letter. There was a brief pause before Weezer continued, and if that isn't enough to get him to take care of things himself, well, he's demonstrated a clearly heroic spirit. It won't take much for our backer to arrange for him to gain a position as a cop somewhere nice and isolated before arranging an exciting case that a poor quirkless officer would naturally die during. Problem solved. Back in Nezu's office, the principal's desk, and a teacup cracked simultaneously. Therapy could wait. First, there was a school district to raise. Ashido Mina liked to think of herself as a superior investigator of people's secrets, especially the romantic ones. She also liked to think she was pretty good at reading people. Apparently, she wasn't quite as good at either as she had previously thought. Okay, so maybe Midoriya's secrets weren't romantic in nature. Heck, there was demonstrably almost no chance that he had seriously considered either her or any of the other girls in the heroics course to be viable romantic partners. Not that she could blame the boy, after everything that he told everyone. Even if he told us everything against his will because of a quirk. she thought to herself with a sickening feeling of guilt. She shook her head, the secrets were out now, and hiding and pretending that she didn't hear them wouldn't help anybody. And then the green-haired boy had untangled himself from the cuddle pile that was about to engage, saying he had to share some final information with Aizawa-sensei. Of course, Mina was not about to leave Midori alone with Aizawa-sensei after those revelations. Clearly there was something that had happened between Aizawa. Mina did note with relief that all of the other heroics course students who had stayed for Midori's impromptu confessional seemed to come to the same conclusion since, as one, both Class 1A and 1B surged after the greenette. And then they heard more. First, something heartbreaking in the revelation that not even Midori's mother had supported his dream to be a hero before he managed to impress All Might enough to have the now retired pro not only tell him something he had probably been dying to hear since his diagnosis, but also give him one for all. Second, she and the rest heard a revelation and recording that enraged them. Not for Bakugo's sake but for Midori's. Not only had those BSTRD who paraded around in gross mockery to what a teacher should be in their negligence. Not only did they actively encourage the abuse that Midori went through, but they also threatened any students who didn't comply to try and pressure Midori into suicide. Mina was seeing red. So much so that she nearly forgot her strong feelings towards Aizawa when he promised Midori that the recordings would be used to justify whatever carnage he was sure Nezu would impart. Great, Ochako said in a voice that Mina had never heard before and prayed she would never hear again. It was a sickeningly sweet tone that at the same time carried ice cold enough to freeze the depths of hell. Let's go. Any warm and fuzzy feelings towards Aizawa disappeared as he just shook his head in a negative manner. As scared of what Ochako's voice as a part of Mina was, she couldn't deny feeling an equal amount of rage, and being denied the opportunity to act on it only served to stoke the flames. Unfortunately, Aizawa had a logical argument before they could even ask why. We want any punishments they receive to stick, and to do that we have to do things properly. He turned away from the now stiffened form of Midori, who was nearly vibrating, and said over his shoulder, "Besides, the star of the show is in no shape to participate in any raids today. Go back to the dorms and rest, Midoriya. We'll contact you when the time comes for you to participate in any raids." Mina could tell Aizawa was full of sit. There was no way that he would involve Midori in something so emotionally raw for him when it overlapped so closely to legal and heroic issues. And, as much as she hated herself for it, she couldn't help but feel a sudden wave of relief at the realization that they had been denied the opportunity for immediate, vindictive action now that she remembered that an emotionally drained Midori would have otherwise brute-forced his way into the operation, something she noted with pleasure that the other girls had a shared opinion on. Suddenly it was as if the strings holding the poor boy up were cut and he started to topple backwards before a glow appeared around his body, and he floated towards Ryuko, halting the cries of shock and concern as they were only just starting to form. Looking down, she saw the sleeping face of Izuku Midoriya, a face that, now that she knew what she did, held an awe-inspiring level of peacefulness. She couldn't help but feel her heart twinge at that realization, and as he floated by, almost against her own volition, she reached out and his face gently, as a small, warm ember sparked to life in her heart. Some part of her mind noted absently that the other girls in arm's reach did the same thing as he drifted by. As she turned her attention to Aizawa, seeing him putting a midnight-branded spray can back into his utility belt, and she realized what he had done. Looking at each of the remaining students, Aizawa simply nodded before saying, "Take care of him. He needs support and understanding now, and he needs it from people who haven't already failed him." He started to walk away before pausing and turning back to them, a mischievous glint in his eyes. "All right, the pizza orders. Hurry up and text them to me or all you're getting is anchovy pizza." Mina heard him chuckle as she, along with her fellow heroes in training, frantically worked to prevent such villainy by lighting up the tired teacher's phone with humane topping requests. As soon as he was out of earshot, she heard Todoroki mutter, "I'll have to ask Midoriya if Aizawa has a minor cat mutation, what with the naps and the anchovies." He audibly shuddered at the last word, causing a few of the students to giggle. Turning around, with Kendo carrying their shared sleeping charge, they all moved towards the dorms to get this joint exercise underway. Now that they were settling back down, an observation detail having been placed on Midori, Ochako having Midori resting his head on her lap at the moment, Mina turned her thoughts back to their train from before the last revelations. She felt herself more assured about the last mental assertion she had made before being derailed. Guilt wouldn't help anyone. What would help would be starting to rebuild Midori's confidence, one block at a time. Then a dangerous, mad idea started to form in her mind. Or one girl at a time. She murmured to herself, "I'm sorry, Mina, did you say something?" Yamomo, who was nearby, asked. Kyoka, who had been sitting between them, was blushing slightly, her jack swaying gently as she clearly tried to tune out the discussion going on around her by focusing on Midori, shifting closer to Ochako, and stroking his hair, something Mina was shocked Ochako tolerated. All it took was looking into the girl's eyes and she understood, though. She had heard Mina too, and she agreed. Mina's smile turned mischievous as she turned her attention back to Yaomomo. Nothing much, Yaomomo. I was just thinking about what Midori said in response to my question earlier, she said, pretending to be nonchalant as she watched the heiress closely. It had been no secret among the girls that for a while at the beginning Yaomomo had held what could be described as at best indifference to the green bean, and for her plan to work properly she needed to be sure how each of the girls who interacted with Midori felt about him. So, she didn't miss how the heiress flinched, before starting to run her fingers through her ponytail, her expression heavy with guilt. What's eating you, Yaomomo? Mina asked, keeping her voice light, a facsimile of her usual bubbly demeanor. She believed she knew full well what the heiress was feeling, but it needed to be set out in the open if Mina's plan was going to have any chance of succeeding. Momo hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with sharing what was going on in her mind. She chewed her lip for a moment, glancing at the boys in the room. Ida seemed to notice her glance, as well as the fact that the girls were surrounding Midori in a circle, resuming their subconscious protective perimeter, and chuckling approached the girls, clearing his throat to get their attention. Mina glanced at him for a moment, irritated at the interruption. Momo, however, appeared grateful, seeming to believe she had received a stay in execution. Pardon me, Mina, I couldn't help but notice that you girls might be getting ready to hold a conversation. If you'd like, you can use this to keep your conversation private so that each of you can speak freely. It was something I had built by May in preparation to try to get Midoriya to open up to Uraraka. And I a bit more. Mina squinted at Ada, catching sight of the uncharacteristically mischievous glint in his eye, coupled with blatant amusement as his gaze fell seeked from Izuku to each of the girls in the circle. Ada seemed to believe something was up, but rather than try to stop it, it seemed that he had decided to try to wingman for his friend. Mina smiled genuinely at the class representative. Thank you, Ida. She took the device and activated it as Ida retreated to the other boys, before turning a now fully predatory smile to the heiress. Now, Yaomomo, in light of Midoriya's honesty today revealing a few things, I think it's only right that we girls speak openly with each other. Her grin turned absolutely feral. So, spill the beans, princess. Yaoyorozu Momo was a bright, diligent, kind, well-behaved girl with incredible heroic potential. While she wouldn't outright disagree with the opinions of others, she couldn't help but feel that as loudly as her praises were sung, such compliments had fallen a bit flat as of late. First, her failure to prevent what happened to Kaminari during the USJ, shaking her confidence in her ability as well as her place amongst her peers in the heroic course, here at UA. Then, her failures during the sports festival, coupled with how easily duped she had been by that pervert Mina, altogether basically confirming that she wasn't meant to be a hero. Something her internship with Uebami and her distressing lack of field work further hammered into her. If only she had heeded Midoriya's warnings about the nature of a majority of Uebami's work, she could have been doing something productive. She flinched internally at the thought, bringing her to her earliest, gravest, and in light of what had just been revealed about the green-haired boy, most DMN failure as a heroine. She remembered how she had categorically dismissed the boy from the first day. How, seeing the damage his quirk had done to his body, she dismissed him as someone who, even if they were properly motivated, would never amount to much. Something she had further felt cemented when she witnessed how shy and reserved he usually was during class. This paired with what she thought was a childish grudge against Bakugo demonstrated during their first exercise. And her guilt only grew when she remembered her resentment at how he had outdone her in the election for office soon after that class. And then he had the audacity to elect Ida as the class representative over her, in spite of the fact that she had gotten the second highest number of votes. And then her dismissal turned to incredulity, between both the USJ and his performance at the sports festival, to frustration at seeing how far he came in only a week after the internships, leaving all of them in the dust on the field now that he wasn't constantly breaking his bones. It wasn't until after the summer camp, though, that her feelings had turned to the respect that the boy had always deserved. Yes, it had taken him charging into danger and coming up with a plan to rescue Bakugo, who up to that point had been nothing but unpleasant to Midoriya, giving the boy, in her mind at least, every excuse to just sit and wait for the abrasive blonde to be rescued. But instead, Izuku had gone out to make sure Bakugo made it back, even going so far as to acknowledge that Kirishima had a better relationship with the boy and made a plan accordingly. A plan that, in spite of going against the will of a villain who could fight on equal footing with All Might, succeeded. And now she was hearing all of Izuku's secrets, and it broke her heart. She realized now how much of a rotten beach she had been to the boy, and worse, she realized that he probably hadn't noticed due to how much worse treatment he was apparently used to receiving up until he came to UA. And so, as she followed the rest, her guilt and self-deprecation warred with the budding warmth she could feel for the green-haired boy, now that she was actually thinking about him, without dismissing everything she had seen him do this time. She had to admit, given everything she knew about him now, coupled with the fondness she had already started to feel for the boy, recently pushed her feelings over the edge into something amorous. She blushed at the thought. She had a crush on Midoriya Izuku. But did she deserve it? Did she deserve to even attempt to be happy with him after everything she had thought about the boy up until now? especially since she only started feeling this way after the object of her recent affections had been forced to divulge his past to the entirety of the heroics course. It was during these conflicting thoughts and doubts of self-worth that Mina had, metaphorically, pinned her to the wall and said, "So, spill the beans, princess." Momo looked around at the other girls hoping for an out, but not seeing one, she sighed and proceeded to explain everything to the gathered girls, from her own lack of confidence to her original opinion on the boy that was the focal point of the current conversation. She then moved on to explain how, over the course of the year, her opinion had changed. How, even before today, she thought of him fondly, though at most as a friend, like she had grown to consider Kyoka much earlier on. She then detailed her feelings of guilt over her past opinions of the boy, as well as the feeling of guilt for her sprouting romantic longing for the green-haired hero, in no small part due to the confessions he had made, as well as her questions about her worthiness. She was shocked to note that at her mention of her feelings of guilt over her new feelings and their suspected cause, the other girls all flinched, even Kyoka and Ochako. After a small pause, Kendo spoke up first, her voice thick with emotion. I think that before we try to help him feel better, or even consider discussing who out of all of us should pursue a relationship with him, we should focus on finding out how to apologize and make it up to him for breaking his trust by digging out his secrets when he was in such a vulnerable place. There was a hushed murmur of agreement from the rest of the girls, coupled with muffled sobs from a few of them. The reminder of how badly Izuku's trust and privacy had been violated, causing guilt and grief to well to the surface again, though they all fought to be as quiet as possible, so as to not wake the boy. Ada turned back to the boys of the heroics course as he heard the privacy field activate, and dropped his playful smile. His friend's words from just before Aizawa entered the room echoed through his mind. No one could ever love someone as defenseless, stupid, worthless, miserable, clumsy, and weak like me. He had seen the looks that his other friend, Uraraka, had sent Midoriya's way before today when she thought no one was looking. He had seen the longing and fondness plain as day. He had also seen the hurt on her face, and how close she was to tears before that bomb was dropped. Ada was awkward, and frequently oblivious to most social cues. But he was, although admittedly it was often belatedly, self-aware enough to realize that fact. So, the fact that he had noticed such cues in the usually much more observant and socially aware Midoriya hadn't used to boggle his mind. And then he had learned about the why of his friend's social awareness, as well as the reason for the glaring gap in said awareness. Ada had felt fury towards the green-haired boy's former classmates that rivaled the wrath he still felt towards Stain. And then he had heard what that had done to his friend. His kind, patient, wise, heroic friend. Ada's teeth clenched before he took a deep breath to calm himself. While the girls held court to handle the possible romantic matters between themselves and Midoriya, he would handle the boys' side and how they would begin making amends for failing him, both as friends and as fellow heroes. Kirishima Ijiro was a cheerful, loyal guy with an admitted obsession with manliness. He was also not a fan of bullying, or bullies in general. So, he was understandably upset to find out that his best friend had been a bully, and worse, a suicide-baiting bully to one of his other friends. It shook him up pretty badly to realize how badly he had misjudged the abrasive blonde. Although the fact that the incident with Quirkless boy who ran in to save one of his classmates that inspired Ijiro to chase after his dreams in spite of his own doubts was in fact a frequent victim of the one he had rescued did make the event even more inspiring to the hardening user. The only question was, how did Ijiro make it up to Midabro? He knew that Midoriya wouldn't want him to push Bakugo away, at least not for his sake. But Ijiro couldn't in good conscience continue as if what Bakugo had done never happened. Could he? It was then that Ada came over and interrupted Ijiro's ruminations. All right, I've given the girls a privacy generator so they can discuss things in private without retreating to their rooms. Now, we have to discuss how we are going to make it up to Izuku for forcing him to reveal such sensitive information when he was vulnerable under the influence of a quirk. Ijiro saw CK an eyebrow at Ada's use of Midabro's given name. You're calling him Izuku now. I thought that it was improper or something like that. Ijiro flinched at the bluntness of his tape-dispensing friend. Ada just shrugged. I feel that, in light of everything we've learned, that formality would be counterproductive in convincing Izuku that we still care about him and view him as friends after what he revealed to us. While it is a personal decision, it is going to be my way to start to repair the damage done. What we need to discuss is what do we do next. Monoma shrugged, eyes haunted and hollow as he looked at the floor blankly. Shouldn't we just apologize? He asked, his tone flat. The boys looked to him confusedly. Would you mind elaborating, Monoma? Ada said, clearly struggling to prevent the formal tone he was accustomed to using from slipping back into his voice. The abrasive blonde of Class B just looked around and said with the same dead tone, don't you get it? We FC'd up by assuming we knew Midoriya before all of this, myself especially included, I'll admit. Doesn't it stand to reason that with how much he's hidden, we have no idea how to make it up to him? He laughed, a short, harsh laugh. Hell, given what he's been through, I don't think even Midoriya knows how we should apologize to him. I mean, it's entirely possible that it won't even occur to him that he deserves an apology. Everyone winced at that, the mood dipping even further. Ada, however, trooper that he was, decided to push forward. Yes, well, I think that is as sound a game plan to start with as any, thank you Monoma. Monoma just huffed, going back to staring at his knees. It was clear that he was wrestling with how he'd been treating Midoriya since their first interactions. As the rest of the Heroics course students, sans Bakugo, were discussing how to make it up to Midoriya for everything, as well as waiting for pizza, a lone figure sat quietly in the back, fiddling with their phone. With the last few taps on the digital keyboard, a few files were sent. The figures sighed to themselves. While they had always had this method of sharing information with their employer, they had refused to take an active part in their role, preferring to be as passive as possible, if only for their own conscience. This time, however, they had learned something that, given their employer's obsession with Midoriya, would hopefully shake things up enough to possibly get their employer's protege, and possibly even the entire league, to change sides. The figure knew that was wishful thinking, however. Hopefully with this, I can finally be free, they whispered to themselves. Shigaraki wasn't sure what to expect when he got a notification from his email that his MSDR had set up specifically for spies set in place to contact Shigaraki directly once things were passed on to him. No, he wasn't sure what to expect. But he sure as FCK wasn't expecting it to be the security footage of his second least favorite person ever being forced to confess it. At least that's what the message that the files were attached to said. So, he set up the computer to share video and audio to their current hideout's TV screen so the league could have a good laugh at the brat's expense. Okay, yes, funds were so tight that they had to have twice using Compress's civilian form clones working a dozen jobs to support them at the moment. But a good TV was essential, damn it. What could possibly go wrong? Shigaraki sat staring dumbly at the TV screen, having just finished playing the last of the video files attached to the email. And all he was feeling was regret. Needless to say, none of the league members were doing much better. Deku-kun, Toga wailed, tears streaming down her face as she slumped against a nearby crate. That poor kid. Divided by SCK to SCK. Twice sobbed as he rubbed as his tears soaked through his mask. Diamante. It seemed that even the unflappable Dabai wasn't unaffected. If Shigaraki wasn't too busy feeling things, he would probably laugh at the clear attempt to hide tears from the resident tough guy. Stain-sama, you truly saw his worth correctly. Spinner, of course, found a way to bring Stain into evenness. That poor boy. Magni sobbed against her giant magnet-themed support gear. Sniff, it seems that we may have been rash in judging the young man. Shigaraki took a steadying breath and opened up the audio files. Hopefully these can brighten our mood. He muttered to himself. Shigi. Yes, Toga. We're going to kill them, right? Yes, Toga, I think we are. Aizawa, Nezu, and All Might stood staring at the burning rubble that was all that remained of Aldera Middle School, having left a similar scene at Aldera Primary School. All evidence pointed to there having been no students present at either school at the time of the incidents. Aizawa glanced at the note that was left pinned above the pile of dust that was settled on and around the principal's seat in the middle school. Dear Nezu, we're giving up villainy. Having learned of Midoriya Izuku's history, we are now going to take on a new life as vigilantes. But still, FCK endeavor. Hopefully you enjoy our first handy work. Getting justice for Deku. Sincerely, Deku's darlings Toga no. The Emerald Shadows Spinner, I swear to God. The Knights in Shige's service. FCKU, Dabai. The Avengers Magni, Y. The League of Vigilantes, the Deku fan club twice. All Might stared over the wreckage, agog, disappointment, word with horror on his face. Aizawa was a little disappointed as well. Though a small part of him felt something akin to smug satisfaction that even villains were brought around by the problem child. That part was violently quashed by the realization that the boy now had a, probably growing, army of people who would do unspeakable things to avenge him. We are not telling Midoriya about this. Nezu chuckled as he folded the note and stored it in his suit coat pocket. Of course not. He turned and hopped off the rubble he had been standing on, before climbing into Aizawa's capture weapon. At least, not until he's had a few private lessons on leading a clandestine organization without besmirching his public image. Aizawa and All Might looked at their boss with matching horrified expressions. Nezu no. The principal of UA merely cackled as he seemed to vanish into the nether, reciting in Aizawa's scarf, Nezu yes. Nezu always yes. Detective Tsukachi looked over the rubble of Aldera Middle School alongside Sansa from the local precinct. The damage that would normally be horrific, after seeing and hearing what he had about what the victims of what happened here had done to All Might's successor, took an almost poetically appealing cast. Sansa looked at Tsukachi, having been the only officer nearby when the recordings had been shared with the detective due to being Tsukachi's friend and protege as a newer officer in the force. Looking back at the scene of destruction, Sansa could only sigh. They're confused, but at least they have spirit, Sansa said sardonically. Tsukachi chuckled dryly, turning away from the scene. Sansa, do we still have that punch bowl that had evidence of being spiked with trigger before someone dumped it out because it tasted funny? Sansa glanced at him askance. You mean the bowl that is stored in the totally does not exist evidence to be planted when pros go overboard section in the precinct? Yeah, we still have it. Why? Tsukachi started walking away. The official story will be that these clowns all got together, got hopped up on trigger-laced punch, then died of natural causes. Understand? Sansa looked at his partner skeptically as he strode to catch up. Natural causes. Tsukachi chuckled as he climbed into the police cruiser. What else do you call this but a natural consequence of antagonizing the League? Nezu liked to put on a front of unaffected amusement when things took an unexpected turn. He'd found that it helped keep his employees on an even keel when they believed that he had everything, even their enemies' movements, accounted for. However, even Nezu was a tad at a loss over the League's latest movements. On one hand, they could have had a genuine universal change of heart, in the leadership at least. On the other, such a drastic genuine change could at best be attributed to a fanfiction with no planning and lazy writing. Nezu's eyes narrowed at the thought. No, there was no way he would allow himself to be held by something so shoddily put together. Certainly a lack of planning would be acceptable. But poor quality writing would never be tolerated, not since he escaped the lab. Nezu, sir. All Might's uncertain voice roused the principal, who shook his head and smiled up at the man from Aizawa's shoulder. Yes, Yagi, Nezu said nonchalantly as he took in his surroundings without moving either his head or his eyes for a hint on what All Might could possibly be calling him for. Ah, yes, the door to his office. Goodness, had he really allowed himself to be so absorbed in thought? He filed the concern away alongside his concerns with the League, as he hopped down to open the door. Ah, well, All Might fumbled, obviously unbalanced by seeing his employer return to visible control of the situation once again. I was just wondering what you had wanted to speak to me about before the, alter a distraction. Nezu chuckled at the phrasing of the descriptor for what had happened. It was certainly fitting, he mused, as he clambered back into his seat behind his desk. Turning to All Might, Nezu made sure both the symbol of peace and Aizawa were in the office before remotely shutting the door behind them, using their distraction to gather his thoughts. Now, where had he been? Yes, he had been preparing to handle these two and their abysmal handling of Midoriya's situation, as well as their own mental health. First things first, he would address All Might, the honestly humbler of the two. Something Nezu mused must have been a side effect of the events of the past year repeatedly chipping away at the hero's sense of self-assurance due to the failures he had made and had been made aware of during that time. Hopefully, by addressing All Might first, Aizawa would be assuaged enough to actually listen to what Nezu had to say this time. Of course, if either or both of them failed to willingly comply by addressing their respective shortcomings, well, Nezu never had a shortage of options available to get the desired results of this meeting. Well, Yagi, I called you to the office to discuss your handling of Mr. Midoriya's training, as well as how you handled the sludge villain incident. Nezu began, noting All Might's gaunt shoulders slump, as Aizawa's shoulders tense. Interesting, Nezu was more grateful than he would ever admit out loud that the tutoring he had undergone with Hound Dog disguised as discussions over tea, especially in situations like this. Am I correct to assume that you're aware of what I want to say, Yagi? Under normal circumstances, with how thoroughly Midoriya had been failed, Nezu would approach the offending faculty with a pure dressing down before moving on to other matters. However, at least with All Might, Nezu believed that the mistakes were ones made in earnest due to inexperience in the field of education, and as such, decided to take the opportunity to do some educating of his own. All Might sighed before sitting down in an armchair across from Nezu, his hands clasped together, elbows resting on bony knees. Knowing you, Nezu-sensei, I believe that you would point out that I allowed my professional hero work to interfere with my teaching of young Midoriya. I failed him repeatedly, from the time I saved him from the sludge villain up until today. He rubbed his face before letting his hands fall as he continued. With the sludge villain incident, I ignored the, in retrospect, obvious signs of physical and emotional abuse young Midoriya had been displaying. All of that not even taking into account the emotional distress I should have been aware of after saving him from drowning when I so casually crushed his dreams. He looked into Nezu's eyes, his own starting to tear up as he choked out. I have been a fool and a failure as a teacher, and a hero. His eyes hardened as he continued. However, I won't quit. I promise to take this opportunity to learn to be a better mentor, a better teacher. Nezu glanced at Aizawa and was pleased to note the grudging acknowledgement and respect on the tired pro's face before turning back to Yagi. It seems that your habit of self-flagellation is still as strong as ever, All Might. He started, his tone slightly amused, before raising a paw for stalling. Any further words from the man? You are correct in identifying your mistakes in handling Mr. Midoriya's question that day, up to a point. However, that is neither here nor there at the moment. He grinned fiercely at the confused expressions of both teachers. No, what you said that day was already addressed by yourself, to some extent. Even if you undermined your student's confidence in his own self-worth by later insisting that he had to have a quirk to ever be a hero. That is a symptom of a deeper underlying issue that you will be addressing with Hound Dog, not myself. No, I simply wanted to ensure that you have some self-awareness to be sure that what is said next will stick. His gaze pinned All Might to the chair. Your greatest failure as a teacher and mentor to Mr. Midoriya lays in your insistence in him keeping the secret to himself for so long, as well as your poor example of trying to tackle the issue of all for one alone. He raised a paw sharply to cut off any protests that might have come from the former symbol of peace, though none were as of yet being attempted, he noted to himself. while the issue of the secret is now effectively moot. The feelings of guilt and failure that Mr. Midoriya will feel in the face of sharing such a secret are not. You made the mistake of insisting that he tell no one, ignoring your own hypocrisy and having told your own circle of confidants. This left Mr. Midoriya with the mistaken impression that One for All was still your quirk, and therefore your secret to share, not his. He noted the look of dawning realization and horror on All Might's face and huffed to himself as he hopped down and strode over to place a paw on his employee's hand, allowing rare emotion beyond light amusement or sadistic glee into his voice to emphasize his next words. Make no mistake, Yagi, while you've hurt Mr. Midoriya, you were also the first one in his corner. He saw as the tears started to flow freely from the man before him that he had his undivided attention. You called yourself a fool, and I'm fully aware that many, yourself included, discount your intelligence. I want to assure you that you are no simple man. You are merely a victim of habit. He chuckled at the looks of surprise on both Yagi's and Aizawa's faces. That's right. It doesn't matter how smart someone is. Anyone can fall into a set of thinking patterns that don't fully utilize what they have available. He returned to the desk to give Yagi some privacy to collect himself. Your thinking pattern was born from a power that was so great that it benefited most from simplicity. This, of course, after years of repetition, seeped into every corner of your mind. While it will take time and arduous practice, I'm sure with proper dedication and care we'll uncover that mind that you've buried behind the facade of power and muscle. Having said his piece to All Might, for now, Nezu turned to Aizawa. As for you, Eraser, I'm sure you have some ideas into your own failures regarding young Mr. Midoriya and Mr. Bakugo. Both men flinched at the mention of the explosive boy's name. If you would like, I can afford you an opportunity to discuss your own failings, as you perceive them. He made sure to keep his gaze strong and unflinching as he met Aizawa's own. The man valued his pride, almost to an unhealthy degree, and had become so taken with his idea of logical ruses that he often got caught in ruses of his own design without realizing it. Aizawa huffed into his scarf. I was lax in reading the files at the beginning of the year, choosing instead to make assumptions based on what I had seen for myself, and act on those assumptions. Unfortunately, regardless of how reasonable such assumptions would normally be, it is clear that doing so has damaged any trust that Midoriya had with me. He sighed again. Though it seems that the trust all of my students had in me has been damaged somewhat. Nezu nodded, pleased at the headway that they had already made. Glancing at the clock showing that it was getting on towards evening, Nezu decided to conclude the meeting for now. Well, it's clear that you're both at least giving this some thought. I think it would be prudent to conclude the meeting for now, although we will speak again in more detail tomorrow, Eraser. Am I understood? At the grunted acknowledgement from the tired man, Nezu let some of the edge fall away from his smile. Excellent. For now, I propose remedial lessons for the both of you, held by yours truly. All Might, your lessons will be focused on uncovering and nurturing your academic mind, as well as polishing your skills as an educator. Eraser, your lessons will be focused on empathy and emotional intelligence. He cheered, allowing himself to bask in the open dismay both men displayed. Now, Eraser, I think that you'll agree that some form of punitive action will be necessary to at least show your students that you're trying to improve. Aizawa gave a grudging nod at this. And of course, for it to hold any weight with these young folks whom we have failed so often, the punishment is going to have to be something genuine and impactful. As such, until further notice, you are to take therapy sessions with Hound Dog, and until he has cleared you for duty, you are removed from your duties as Class 1A's homeroom teacher. Furthermore, once you return to duty as homeroom teacher, your patrols will have a strict curfew in place. Seeing Aizawa about to argue, Nezu pressed on. Furthermore, to make sure that you're sticking to this arrangement, I have taken the liberty to hire a teacher's assistant for you to help during this period of time. Thankfully, you've given the heroics course academic leave for the time being. So, hopefully, you take this seriously enough that you will be cleared for duty as a teacher again by the time your students return to the classroom. Pressing a button on his desk to open the door to his office as a clear sign of dismissal, Nezu concluded by saying, Now, I believe both of you have therapy sessions to schedule, and then sleep to catch up on. The situation with these two was far from over. However, at least this was a start, and with how the league was acting, hopefully they'll have time to properly address everything before anything truly major happens. Ryo Inui, or the pro-hero, and UAS counselor Hound Dog was a passionate individual. Caring and empathetic, though he also had strong feelings about what was right and wrong, and wasn't afraid to let people know how he felt. Unfortunately, one of his quirk's side effects was that when he got too emotional, human speech fled. Of course, his colleagues liked to compliment him and say that he had a good grasp of the bigger picture 9 times out of 10. Unfortunately, situations like the one faced by Midoriya Izuku wasn't one of those times. Ryo felt for Midoriya. Not only did the boy have to go through everything, but he also got caught up in one of Nezu's schemes. Worse yet, the boy had been the focal point of this particular psychological catastrophe. Ryo huffed indignantly at the memory of what had transpired today, as he trudged to Heights Alliance dorms, angling for 1A's building carrying pizzas that Lunch Rush had made specifically for the Hero Course students to make sure that the teenagers were fed, since they probably wouldn't be, emotionally speaking, up for general societal interaction. As the man recalled the contents of the footage of Midoriya detailing his past, against his will, Ryo had noted with particularly potent rage, he couldn't help but tremble with fury at the boy's treatment. However, as his mind turned to Midoriya's primary tormentor, he could only sigh sadly. He had played over the audio recording that the security cameras had picked up multiple times, and one thing stuck out to him. The Aldera School Board had an unusually deep network of corruption to be able to have even police officers helping hide their malpractices. Further, they seemed to have a very skilled team of people dedicated purely to the manipulation of young children. If everything Midoriya and Bakugo demonstrated, coupled by the testimony under hypnosis, was any indication, what stood out most about the duo was that neither of them had up to that point behaved as if Bakugo had done anything wrong. As if what he and his peers had done to Midoriya was somehow natural, and Ryo felt chills run down his spine at this particularly unpleasant thought, even generally accepted as a fact of life. Such thinking patterns could not be possible without the systemic interference of the teachers and other faculty daily reinforcing the abuse Midoriya went through as both justified and his own fault, as well as, evidently, Bakugo's birthright, all because of the natures of their respective quirks. Ryo shook his head, taking deep calming breaths, so that his announcement would be more than growls, barks, and howls, before he strode through the doors calling out pizza dlvry, in his most cheerful and friendly voice. As the boys in the common room swarmed him and took the pizzas off of him, he noticed that the girls had by and large ignored him, seemingly deep in discussion. This puzzled him for a moment as he couldn't hear anything before he noticed one of Hatsume's privacy cubes in the center of the ring of girls. He then silently thanked Nezu for insisting that any functional piece of technology made by support course students be monitored and registered by Power Loader, not only to ensure that no corporate spies could steal from such talented individuals, but also to allow the staff to know what to expect when they saw an otherwise unfamiliar device on campus to prevent panic after the villain attacks of the past year. Noting that Midoriya was being taken care of, or at least watched over as he slept, Ryo stepped fully into his persona of hound dog as he proceeded to the dorm rooms to collect Bakugo. As he climbed the stairs, he noted gratefully, not for the first time, that it was DMN lucky that Recovery Girl was also a licensed therapist, even if she wasn't actively practicing at the moment. That, as well as her pre-existing rapport with Midoriya, meant that Hound Dog could dig out as much of Bakugo's secrets as possible without worrying about conflicting interests being quite so big a problem. He was still going to want to punt the kid, though. As Izuku woke up staring at a brightly lit ceiling without All Might adorning it, he started to panic, until familiar padded fingertips ran through his hair soothingly, allowing him to start to calm down. Then the memories of what had happened leading up to him falling asleep in the first place came back in full force, and the roiling, burning, electric feeling of anxiety surged through him in full force as he surged into a sitting position and looked around him wildly. The only thoughts going through his head was that they knew. Everyone knew. Not only about One for All, but also all about his past as a quirkless prior to All Might granting him such an incredible power. All Izuku could think was how everything was over, how all the strong work he had put into making friends had gone to waste, how everyone would hate him, how Ida and Uraraka. And suddenly his thoughts screeched to a halt momentarily before speeding up as he began to spiral even further. Uraraka knew. She knew everything. Would she be upset with him for lying about his quirk? Would she be disappointed that he hadn't told her about OFA? Would she be disgusted? Izuku choked back a sob as he stared down at the carpet between his legs, tears starting to blur his vision. Then something truly horrifying surfaced in his memory. He had confessed to Uraraka. Sure, it was under the influence of a quirk, but it had been a quirk that forced someone to speak only the truth. Oh gods, she really was going to be disgusted with him, wasn't she? As the poor, abused teen spiraled further into his doubts and insecurities, he failed to notice that in his panic, he wasn't just thinking at the moment. He was only brought out of his internal dialogue and into the real world when the wind was knocked out of him as he was tackled from all sides by the girls of classes 1A and 1B. The first person to speak was a sobbing Uraraka. "Don't," she cried emphatically as she rested her tear-stained cheek on his back. "Don't do this to yourself, Izuku. I care about you." As Izuku did his best to look over his shoulder at her, she gestured at all of the girls in the hug pile. "We care about you. You, not your quirk." Izuku opened his mouth, shocked and bewildered at the behavior he was witnessing, only now remembering that these girls had been in a similar position when he came to. After he had confessed about his experience at Aldera, and he couldn't help but ask, "B, but why? I'm J, just A." Before he could even start to list his usual list of forcefully memorized self-deprecations, a metal jack whisked under his chin and pressed threateningly against his chin. "Don't you dare finish that sentence." Jiru growled, glaring up at him from her position alongside Yaoyorozu on his chest, anger and grief clear in her eyes. He stared down at her flabbergasted, and a little intimidated. But he believed in that moment, honest as his mother taught him, persisted in trying to explain. But the jack dug in further as she raised herself up to eye level with him, her glare turning fierce, and her mouth set into a determined line. No. At that point, Asui took over, turning his head to the side, causing him to be caught under the hurt glare she was leveling at him. Listen here, Izuku-kun. None of us care about your quirk, or how you got it. The one we care about is you. Izuku could only look down and away from her, muttering, "Would you even know who I was if it wasn't for my quirk?" At his words, the girls stilled as they contemplated what he had said. Izuku, of course, interpreting their silence and stillness as an admission, tried to pull out of the hug pile, even though he didn't want to, but was pulled back to a sitting position. This time the one who grabbed a hold of his face was Yaoyorozu. "I'll be the first to admit that I don't know if we would know you without OFA." As Izuku opened his mouth, she cut across any attempt to speak with a finger pressed to his lips. "I'm not done. The only person here who would know that is you, Izuku. You are the only one who would have been able to decide to train enough to get into UA without a quirk. If you had done the training that you performed in order to get OFA as well as martial arts training, I'm sure that we would have been able to get to know you." Ashido came into his field of view, bringing along Uraraka, as Asui shifted around so that she was visible next to Jiro. Izuku vaguely noting that the other girls had shifted positions to accommodate this, with Hagakure now resting her chin on his shoulder, his shirt becoming damp from her own tears. Mina cleared her throat before speaking. "Midori, it's not OFA that made you a hero. In fact, it's damaged you so badly that if you're not careful you might not be able to use your arms ever again." The girls collectively flinched at that, and Izuku was shocked into silence, unable to formulate a response. How had she known? Seeing his stunned expression, Ashido shuffled in place, a look of embarrassment on her face. "I had heard you were hurt when I woke up after training camp. And then I remembered how your hands looked after Todoroki, and I knew. You had been fighting real villains, not that the other villains you fought aren't real, it's just..." Blinking rapidly, shocked at the speed the pink-skinned girl was talking, Izuku reached out to place his hand on her shoulder, causing her to flinch. He waited for her to look him in the eyes before he said softly, "Ashido, breathe." As he said this, he demonstrated taking a slow breath, which she mimicked before giggling slightly, a blush on her face. "See, this is what we're talking about, Midori. You're a hero, with or without a quirk." Yaoyorozu spoke up again. "In fact, in light of what Mina has just shared, I think it's safe to say that you're a hero in spite of your quirk, not because of it." That last thought shocked Izuku badly. Had it all might been wrong. His mind almost recoiled away from such a treacherous thought towards his mentor instinctively. But could he really say that, at least in the beginning, he had truly benefited from having OFA? Not that he was considering giving it up or anything, but considering everything, from the broken bones to the lack of actual guidance on the use of his quirk. Could Yaoyorozu be right? Naturally, Izuku, devotee to all things All Might, rapidly discarded that particular train of thought. For now, Uraraka cleared her throat, before continuing. "Izuku, there's something that we need to tell you," she said, gesturing to the girls lined up in front of him. Then all 5 girls said at the same time, "We like you, Izuku Midoriya. Please go out with us." Izuku.exe has crashed. Please wait a moment while systems reboot. Thank you for your patience. Takage joked from behind the girls, snapping Izuku out of it. "But me, boo why?" he responded intelligently. Uraraka nodded firmly, hands clenched on her knees. "You saved me from the 0-pointer. Asui looked at him resolutely. "You saved me at the USJ." Yaoyorozu smiled gently at him. "You inspired me to keep trying to improve as a hero." Mina grinned at him. "You believed in me, even when I doubted myself." Jiro looked at him abashedly. "Seeing you clean up that beach every day inspired me to keep up my own training to make it in here." All 5 girls and Izuku were shocked when a surprisingly shy Hagakure joined their declarations of the reasons why they had feelings for him. "You see me." Recovering quickly, the girls all smiled radiantly at him. Uraraka speaking again, evidently the de facto leader of the girls in this moment. "We all want to be with you, together, Izuku. But we also don't want to pressure you into anything. Take your time to think it over, we can." "Okay, I'll go out with all of you," Izuku said without hesitation, shocking all of the girls, before his bravado abandoned him, replaced by his usual timidity. That is I if you really want to." The girls all giggled at that, and they all hugged him even tighter, before each girl leaned up and embraced him on the lips. Once all of the girls had finished embrace him, and he had recovered from his shock, Ada walked over to the group with all of the boys from the heroics course, as all of the girls stood up and faced Izuku. "Izuku," Ada said, looking at his friend firmly, "now that most of what the girls wish to speak about with you has, hopefully, been resolved, there's something that all of us in the heroics course need to say to you." Izuku tensed as he waited for them to tell him that everything the girls had said was a sick joke, and start beating him up or something. When everyone bowed at the waist to him, and said in unison, "We're so sorry, Izuku." Izuku, once again demonstrating his mastery of Japanese, simply responded, "Shitty Deku." Katsuki Bakugo fumed as he stormed out of the lobby of the dorms to go to his room. Not only had he just gotten house arrest for fighting the Diamond nerd, only to properly learn the secret behind his suddenly gaining a quirk, alongside assurances that he wasn't the reason that All Might retired, something he still couldn't fully bring himself to believe. If he was honest, that fight was the first time Katsuki had really seen the nerd in, what was it, years. Katsuki stopped just on the other side of the door as he shook his head to clear it, which proved to be a mistake. As he stopped, he heard what Copycat said to Deku, and he felt angry for some reason. Maybe it was because Deku was finally starting to act like a respectable hero, rather than a sniveling sissy. A flash of a much smaller hand flitted through his mind as a familiar, if more childish voice asked, "Are you okay?" Katsuki shook his head, trying to focus as he listened to the nerd's response. After all, the nerd can't lie. Everyone will know how he was looking down on me, he told himself with vindictive glee. Only, that's not what happened. Instead, Katsuki listened as everything was laid bare from his and the nerd's time in Aldera. And even Katsuki had to admit that what was done to him was sickening. Even worse, he was reminded how often he had been a part of the nerd's torment and suffering. A part of him wanted to scoff and dismiss the nerd's words as bullshit. But Katsuki knew that the nerd couldn't lie, not now. But Katsuki desperately wished he could lie. If everyone learned what he'd done, what he said, his rep would be ruined. Then Katsuki realized what he'd just thought and he was stunned. My father desperately wanted to be number one. I quote him, going to be the number one hero, surpassing even All Might. Have ... You ever heard about Quirk marriages? Was this how Endeavor thought? He wanted to be number one too, but the way Endeavor treated his family. Would his first thought when his past wrongs were uncovered be about his reputation? Katsuki started to shake, his mind racing, comparing things he said to what he had learned about Endeavor. He couldn't be that bad, could he? You like winning, don't you? But then, if he wasn't as bad as Endeavor, why would the League abduct him to try and recruit him? And then, he heard Deku say what he told him that day. The words that Katsuki did everything to forget he'd ever spoken. You know, if you want to be a hero so bad, there might actually be a way to do it. Take a swan dive off the roof and pray for a quirk in your next life. Suddenly all the strength left Katsuki's legs, as he fell to his knees. He heard the nerd continue his story, and his BLD ran cold as he heard that the weakling had been attacked by the sludge villain too. Not only that, but he had been saved by All Might, just in the nick of time. And then he heard something that should have made him feel glee. All Might had agreed with him. Without a quirk, the nerd could have never been a hero. But there was one problem. Deku had a quirk, one he had gotten from All Might himself, because he was worthy. Didn't that prove that All Might had thought that Deku was already a hero when he gave the nerd OFA? But he had told Deku that he couldn't be a hero without a quirk. As Katsuki's thoughts started to spiral, he felt invisible bands of iron constrict around his chest, as a ghostly claw seemed to gouge into his mind. Meanwhile, it felt like a barbed, jaggedly bladed hand was rummaging around his guts. Katsuki recognized the feeling, or at least the sensations, though his was one he'd felt only twice before. Once when he'd seen the leader of the League of Villains, and once when he'd lost to Deku. Katsuki fled. I can't be that bad, he desperately pleaded with himself as he slammed his door shut, falling to his rump as he braced against the door to his room, his head in his hands, trying to take steadying breaths. He started to calm down as the voices of everyone from his middle school came back to him. They were singing his praises. He could do no wrong. It wasn't his fault. It wasn't his fault. So, why didn't he really believe that? A small part of his mind sneered at him, mocking him over how worked up he was getting over something he already knew about. Something he had known about for years. Hell, what the nerd was saying was something he had been a part of. So, why did it hurt now that he actually thought about what he'd done? Deku deserved what Katsuki had done to him. It was his fault for being quirkless. That's a serious accusation, young man. Let me take you to an associate of mine who can help. Katsuki's head started to hurt. A splitting headache like a hatchet was being driven right down the middle, as his ears rang, a sound like struck glass. It was so loud. Katsuki started slamming his head against the floor, clutching his hair in his fists, screaming in rage, fear, and grief. What had he done? He could hear the nerd from when they were younger. When we grow up, we're going to be heroes. You're so cool, Kakin. Katsuki curled up into it and cried. He could figure out the why of everything later. For now, he couldn't stop feeling things. And so, for now, he wept. A knock on the door dragged Katsuki out of whatever haze he had been in. He got up, a customary snarl on his face as he opened the door. What the FCK do you want? He said before he registered who he was talking to. After a moment though, it registered. He had been speaking to Hound Dog, one of the faculty members of UA. Well, if he wasn't FCK'd before, he sure as hell was now. He couldn't help the tears that started flowing again. Though he felt embarrassed over it, he also knew well enough to not slam the door in the pro-hero's face. Even if he really wanted to. Can I come in? Hound Dog said, voice calm and soft, but not comforting. It was the kind of voice used for dangerously deranged villains, not a distraught teenager. Katsuki had enough good sense that it wasn't an actual request. He stepped out of the way as the larger figure of the school's guidance counselor negotiated his way through the door, sidling in, through the narrow opening. So, I saw the security footage, and heard everything that Midoriya said about Aldera. Katsuki winced. Of course the teachers would have cameras in the shared living spaces. The only question since the nerd had got hit by that quirk had been how long it would take for the school to do anything about it. At Nezu's request, you're being moved to other lodgings below the main school building for the time being. Shocked, Katsuki looked up at Hound Dog, staring intently, trying to figure out the game that the man in front of him was playing. There had to be an angle here. What was it though? You're not expelling me, he asked before his mind recovered from his surprise. However, as soon as he had recovered from his shock, he cursed himself for asking such a stupid question. Hound Dog simply shook his head. Nezu's orders. Both yours and Midoriya's situation is complicated, to say the least. So, for now we're moving you away from your peers, at least in part for your own safety. As Katsuki was about to speak, Hound Dog raised a hand and said, "Make no mistake. You will be punished." However, Nezu does believe that this situation requires thorough investigation before appropriate measures can be taken against you. So we're removing you from the dorms to prevent your peers from acting rashly in the heat of the moment. Katsuki shut his mouth and nodded, then he opened his mouth again and asked, "So, when do I leave, and how much should I pack?" Hound Dog simply nodded at Katsuki's questions before gesturing around the room. "Only pack what you don't want destroyed when the angry mob gets here. The school will provide clothes during your stay in the alternative lodgings." Katsuki nodded and quickly went to his desk and grabbed a framed card with All Might on it and walked back over to Hound Dog. "I'm ready." Hound Dog looked at the only item Katsuki grabbed, CC'd his eyebrow before striding to the balcony, grabbing Katsuki by the scruff as he went. "Hey, what the FCK?" Katsuki managed before he was hauled over the railing and into the night. Nezu sipped his tea as he observed Ryo-san transporting Mr. Bakugo to the holding cell so that he could be kept out of trouble for the foreseeable future, at least until Nezu had compiled all the evidence that had been collected by Tsukachi-kun on Aldera. It would be necessary to investigate the nature and extent of the influence has on Katsuki. He sighed, musing to himself, not for the first time today, that sometimes his plans work a little too well. Perhaps he should have listened to Ryo-san's advice about having Mr. Midoriya attend therapy at least once before resorting to such drastic measures. Nezu then flipped the monitor to check on Izuku. Oh, and the other heroics course students as well. Nezu mentally chastised himself before continuing, although even he had to admit it was significantly harder to remember the others when they didn't constantly break themselves and otherwise make them more liable to have a lawsuit for negligence. He grimaced at that thought as he reached for a phone. As the phone rang, Nezu calmed himself until, once he heard the voice of a woman on the other side of the line, awash with concern. "Hello, Ms. Midoriya, I hope that everything is going well for you today." His chipper voice and nodding were him trying to calm down the distraught mother. As such, once she calmed down, his voice got serious for a moment. "Ms. Midoriya, as much as I wish I was calling you for pleasure, I have something that you should hear about immediately." He took a deep breath before he continued. "Today your son had been hit by a quirk. Today had been a long day. And, knowing what he did about Midoriya, Nezu felt he had reason to believe that it wasn't over yet. Tetsu was a straightforward, kind, brave manly guy. Some people might NTMT that his personality, or his quirk would make him denser than steel. Those people would be very wrong, at least emotionally. Tetsu had seen Kendo making eyes at 1A's cinnamon roll. He hadn't been sure exactly what had caused it, but he knew she had feelings for the guy. And now that everyone knew all of Midabro's secrets, Tetsu had been sure that Kendo would confess alongside the other girls. But she hadn't. She looked on sadly alongside the other 1B girls as Midabro's new girlfriends crowded around him, assuring him that he deserved the love they felt for him. So, Tetsu pulled Kendo aside to interrogate her. Picking up the privacy cube, Tetsu led the big sister of 1B to the kitchen before putting the cube on the counter and activated it. Kendo looked at him confusedly, trying to muster a genuine smile. "What's up, Tets?" she asked with false cheer in her voice. "Why didn't you confess too?" Tetsu demanded. Okay, maybe he could work on social delicacy a bit more, he mused internally. Kendo's eyes softened, sadness coming to the surface. "I was that obvious, huh?" Tetsu nodded, head CC'd to the side in confusion. "I don't get it, Kendo, you're usually pretty DMN straightforward with the feelings stuff. So, why didn't you, and any girls in our class not confess to Midabro?" Kendo's eyebrow CC'd at the obvious, even if unsaid comment that Tetsu knew that all of the girls had feelings for Midoriya, if not before tonight, then certainly now. After a moment of not getting any kind of feedback in response to her unsaid question, Kendo began her explanation. "It was decided that we would wait for a bit before confessing our feelings to Mai," she sighed before correcting herself, dropping the act completely. "Izuku. Originally each girl from both classes were going to confess our feelings for him individually to try to avoid overwhelming him. However, it became clear when he woke up, from his mutterings before he was completely aware of his surroundings, that he still has massive insecurity issues. And I mean massive, Tets," she said as she waved her hands, clear exasperation and frustration evident in the gesture. She leaned back against the counter as her arms fell back to her side. "So, we had a quick discussion before he came to. We decided that the Wanna girls would all share their feelings first, as they would be the easiest ones to believe when they told him how they felt." She glanced over at the girls still surrounding the now openly sobbing Green Bean, an affectionate smile on her lips. "After all, he needs as solid a support system as possible as quickly as we can build it, especially now that his secrets are out." She glanced at Tetsu who nodded in understanding. Midoriya had always had confidence issues, and having his history of being bullied exposed would do very little on its own to bolster his confidence. In fact, Tetsu surmised that it was highly likely that Midoriya believed that everyone who heard would have been disgusted by him. Now that his history as a quirkless individual had come to light, the thought causing him to grimace. Shaking his head, Tetsu focused on Kendo. "All right, that explains why they confessed, but not why you did not," he pressed. She just chuckled a bit, finding Tetsu's resilient bullheadedness as amusing as it was exasperating. "We decided not to confess to Izuku because we didn't want to overwhelm him. It was decided by all of us 1B girls unanimously that we would wait to share our feelings with him, instead supporting him platonically until he becomes used to the idea that we aren't going to abandon him just because he wasn't born with a quirk." Tetsu nodded in understanding and agreement with the logic shared. "All right, but don't wait too long, Kendo. We both know how easy it is to get stuck in a situation when it becomes both comfortable and familiar," he said, leveling a serious gaze at her, before he flashed a brilliant smile and asked, "So, what's the game plan for when you girls confess? Would you want any assistance from the guys, or do you girls want to fly solo for this?" Kendo chuckled at her friend's enthusiasm, touched by his willingness to help with this. "We decided that we should wait until he's at least gone to at least one therapy session with Hound Dog. As much as we all have feelings for him, some of us only realized how we felt after his confession about his past, and we want to make sure that we aren't romantically interested in him because we feel sad over his pain." She chuckled before saying, "Besides, it's not like we don't have a whole month to test the waters out and form the relationships responsibly and not as an odd form of mass trauma bonding or something." Tetsu nodded at that, not that he wholly believed her, but he wouldn't push her on it. It was her choice and he would respect it. Deciding to change the topic a bit, he said, "How's Shiozaki holding up?" "I would have thought that she would condemn something like this." Kendo giggled a bit before saying, "Actually, after everything we've heard, she seems to be of the opinion that not providing Izuku with all of the confidence-boosting love and affection as we can is even more sinful than sharing him. And I quote, 'It would be the greatest sin to attend to Izuku's heart with anything less than our full love and affection.'" Setsuna looked over to where Tetsu took Itsuka, musing over how she had believed, wrongly apparently, that those two had feelings for each other. At the very least, it seemed that the big sister of one had feelings for Green Bean for a couple of weeks at the very least. Kendo shook her head when asked why she was interested in Izuku, whose given name all of the girls decided to try using to show that they viewed him favorably and wanted to be closer to him. "I think it started a couple of weeks ago. Did you girls know he was training even after one of All Might's heavier classes?" She looked around at the surprised faces, a smile forming on her face. "Anyway, one of the days I decided to visit one of the gyms, and I found my Izuku training, throwing kicks, and I guess it was early days in his practice, but his form was terrible." She giggled a bit at the memory. "So, obviously I couldn't just let that slide, and after talking to him, I started showing up to train with him and teach him how to actually fight properly." Mina kept her head to the side. "But, with his power, does Midoriya really need to improve his form or technique? Can he just?" Struggling to find the word, she threw a wild punch before shrugging. Kendo shook her head. "Insane amounts of power is no excuse for poor form. Besides, if nothing else, learning how to fight properly should, hopefully, reduce the number of broken bones in the future," she said with the last part with a cheerful voice, the other girls flinching at the reminder of Izuku's penchant for self-harm in the line of duty. Needless to say, they all agreed, less broken bones for their shared crush would be desirable. Setsuna shook herself out of her recollection of the conversation. She understood why they decided to wait. But didn't that kind of get thrown out the window when all the girls from Wanna confessed? I mean, come on. It didn't look like it took too much mental effort for Green to agree to date all of them. Taking a breath, Set shook her head. That wasn't fair of her. Not to Izuku, and not to the girls from 1A. Kendo had been right, she told herself. It would be better to give Izuku time to adjust to the idea that people actually cared about him. And, if it meant actually having the boy she liked believe her when she told him how she felt about him, then that's exactly what she would do. Besides, a few well-timed dates should be very convincing about how serious we are about this whole thing. Set looked over at Izuku talking with everyone, the memory of how she had fallen for the boy coming to the surface briefly. Shaking her head, she resolved herself to support not only Izuku but all the girls in this relationship over the coming month they now learned they had off of school. While the Heroics Course students were busy bonding and building a strong support network with, and for Izuku Midoriya, Nezu was in the midst of explaining some of what had come to light to Inko Midoriya. And, it would be safe to say that she was taking it about as well as could be expected, all things considered. Katsuki Bakugo said what? Ms. Midoriya shrieked on the other side of the line, audibly livid about what she had just heard. Indeed, Ms. Midoriya. Now, if you wouldn't mind coming up to the campus, I can have the video played for you, so you can have a clearer picture of everything since it seems clear that your son had withheld information from you about his treatment at the hands of his middle school. Nezu said, amicably, noting the shocked sob from the distraught mother on the other end of the phone. Nezu was well aware of Inko Midoriya's quirk, as well as its potential applications, should she become angry enough to consider doing so. As such, Nezu was being as cautious as possible to manage Ms. Midoriya's emotions to the best of his, admittedly limited abilities. Manipulative. Yes. Vile. Absolutely. Under normal circumstances, Nezu would have shied away from such tactics with a civilian, especially a civilian who was the parent of one of his students. However, Ms. Midoriya, regardless of how understandable it was demonstrating near homicidal levels of fury, and Nezu was determined that finding out that his mother was now classified as a villain because she found out how badly he'd been hurt was not something Izuku would have to worry about in the near future. No, the boy had suffered enough in this chimera's humble opinion. The thought about what the boy had gone through caused Nezu to absent-mindedly rub the bottom of the scar on his face. Nezu let Ms. Midoriya work through the fury that was left undulled by the guilt that had been brought to the surface, as he listened to the normally sweet and gentle woman utilize a vocabulary that was expansive in such a way that it would make a sailor blush and a demon pale in fear. Nezu was glad that he had only told her of young Mr. Bakugo's suicide baiting that had taken place around a year ago now. Thinking of the time that had passed, admittedly, disgusted Nezu, as it felt too close to being permissive of Bakugo's behaviors at that time, something Nezu would never do. However, Nezu couldn't deny that behavioral improvement had been made, especially given what was revealed about the boy's past actions. Yes, Nezu decided, it would be best for all parties involved that Inko not learn the full extent of what had been done to her son, until she was in a place where midnight was readily available. And wearing Quirk suppressors. One couldn't be too careful with that Quirk after all. He would be making sure All Might was going to be in arm's reach, however. Whether that allowed the man to be emotional support, or get his butt kicked, remained to be seen. Either way, he had to take responsibility for his part in Ms. Midoriya's distress over the past year in regards to her son. After her tirade came to a close, Ms. Midoriya took a deep breath and asked the question that Nezu knew would be coming. Nezu, where is my son right now? Inko asked with false calm, ice and steel in her voice not even remotely hidden to UAS principle. Nezu glanced at the cameras for a moment before answering. Well, according to the security footage, your son seems to be getting extensive emotional support from his classmates, though it seems the young ladies of his class are being the most proactive in tending to Mr. Midoriya. He noted, knowing full well the chaos of a doting mother who'd just gotten a hint of romance in her son's life he had primed to be unleashed upon the young hero. What? Just because he didn't feel like Izuku should suffer doesn't mean he was above aggravating the boy. Besides, this should hopefully cement to Izuku that his mother truly did care about him. Hopefully. Inko sighed, seemingly relieved at the revelation. Very well then, I will be there in about an hour, she said before she hung up the phone. Nezu sighed in relief. That could have gone much worse. He couldn't help the chill that ran up his spine as a small part of his mind detailed exactly how gruesome his fate could be if he mishandled the situation with the woman coming to see the full story of her son's suffering. Tamura Shigaraki was many negative things, but stupid was not one of them. As such, he knew that he couldn't just abandon his current path of being a villain, in spite of the letter left for the heroes to find. He could however learn more about the green-haired brat, Izuku Midoriya. Shigaraki had noticed, now that he'd heard Midoriya's past, that his sensei had been very wrong about the boy. As a matter of fact, given what he knew now about Midoriya, it was possible that sensei had only cared about the quirk that the boy held. He was also conflicted. Sensei had been there for him when no one else had been. It was a fact that the way that society was needed to change, it needed to be destroyed. His knowledge about the way Midoriya had been treated only cemented that fact in his mind. Although, it also brought up the point that just destroying society as it stood wouldn't be enough. He had been thinking about this while he had been out and about avenging Midoriya upon the so-called schools the brat had attended before UA. He'd looked over the databases he had Kurogiri extract before the destruction began in earnest, and he was sickened. Hell, even Sensei would take issue with the behaviors of the faculty members in the Aldera school district that those files indicated. At least, Shigaraki wanted to believe Sense would be sickened. However, he also learned the name of Midoriya, Izuku's mother, that she had lodged hundreds of complaints against the school district students' behavior, and the teachers' evident apathy and general inaction towards bullies. He'd also learned that that particular district had a large backer through various generous donations from one Denderet company via the Hearts and Minds political party coffers. And while Shigaraki wasn't sure what that meant, he felt like it couldn't be good. Shaking his head, he turned to the file that had targets of assassination if needed to further the shul's goals, or, in the case of Midoriya because the child was quirkless, where he found a name that made his BLD boil on behalf of the brat. INKOMIDORIYA alongside the name was an obviously outdated photo, since it also showed Midoriya as a toddler, something Shigaraki saved for if he needed to bribe Toga for later. He then studied the picture of the brat's mother, and something in the back of his mind started to itch. Tenko Shimura started to stir. Inko Midoriya could generally be described with a few phrases. Anxious, kind, loving, a doting mother. Just to name a few. At the moment, however, the phrase that could best describe her was PSS. She had just gotten off the phone with Nezu, the principal of UA, and a close friend of the family since her late mother's younger days. Normally that would be a pleasant surprise, however this time he had contacted her not as a family friend, but as the principal of UA, which would have gotten her anxieties up under the best of circumstances. Pair that with the news of the destruction of Izuku's old elementary and middle schools. Inko shuddered with worry and fear at the thought of what the Chimera could have found out about her son to trigger such a strong response that not even the HPSC would cover it up. Because, while yes, the HPSC leadership disliked Nezu, not even the current Beach president could deny how effective his methods were at turning out actually effective heroes. And then Nezu dropped a bomb in her lap, and, for a moment she hadn't known what to do with it. Now, however, she knew exactly what she wanted to do with it. She was going to take this particular bomb and shove it up a little blonde BSDRD's deep breaths, Inko. Deep breaths. She scolded herself as she got dressed, carefully choosing what she was going to wear to the meeting she had just been invited to. She knew Nezu enough to know that what he had revealed over the phone was most likely the smallest reveal about her son's time in the Aldera school district. He had obviously also chosen the reveal that would be most likely to drive her to focus her rage and action into getting to UA promptly. All the evidence pointed to the fact. She also knew Nezu enough to predict that both Midnight and Quirk suppressors would be present. And as much as she knew that should infuriate her, and would certainly infuriate her son, should he ever find out. She also knew herself well enough to believe that would probably be the wisest course of action considering how she was feeling right that moment. Inko was PSS again. She was also considerably less understanding about the Quirk suppression bands locked onto her wrists. She wanted to tear through every single one of Izuku's teachers and former classmates. She especially wanted to use her Quirk to castrate one Katsuki Bakugo in as painful a way as possible. She, however, couldn't do any of that. Apparently there was a FC King spy in UA. Furthermore, all evidence pointed to it being one of her son's current classmates. The only thing that prevented her from redirecting all of her considerable fury into tearing through her son's peers to find the culprit was the fact that they had evidently been unwilling participants. They evidently had also been hoping that her son's story would change things enough to free them from their ties to the League of Villains. Evidently the students' plan had worked better than even they could have expected, if the letter from the League detailing their reason for what they'd done to all of the public schools in the Aldera school district at this point was any indication. Apparently even the most abhorrent criminals drew the line somewhere in what she had learned her son had been going through and hiding from her for the past decade. And so, they decided to handle the situation before Nezu even had the chance to begin an investigation to make sure any actions against the schools and the board responsible would stick. Not surprisingly, Nezu was only miffed that he wouldn't be able to get his claws into the responsible parties himself. Inko shook her head to refocus her thoughts. She was letting her mind wander to try to cope with the revelations she had just learned. Especially the fact that the faculty were the main instigators of her precious baby's torment, if the recording she had just heard was to be believed. They had even stooped so low as to threaten students to get them to participate in the torture and attempts in baiting him into. She couldn't even contemplate it. She could contemplate, however, what she had learned about her son's Quirk. As such, she had been beating the now retired symbol of peace over the head with a slipper since she learned about what he had told her baby at first, which she learned after finding out that a FCKING supervillain was targeting her baby because of it. So needless to say, all pain inflicted upon the man who had been the closest thing her son had to a father figure since. GRAH. Just thinking about that man. She took calming breaths, slightly thankful that her Quirk's secondary mutation that enhanced intelligence allowed her to split her focus between the act of beating the man next to her and hearing her son's whole story. She had stopped beating him at the reminder that not even she had vocalized support for her son's dream before he had gotten a Quirk. The realization crushed her. She recalled how her rage had subsided slightly, just enough for gratitude in his support of her son's dreams, even without a Quirk. Something that, considering everything he had been through, probably saved Izuku in ways only her son probably understood at the moment. She also admitted that any physical action against Katsuki would probably be counterproductive in her current mental state. That didn't mean she wouldn't show the recordings to Mitsuki once she had been sworn to secrecy. Probably with a Quirk that enforced such oaths in play. There was probably at least one lawyer out there with a Quirk that made contracts truly binding. Right. Oh, well, that was a problem for future Inko. For now she wanted to see her baby. As she got up to leave to see her son, Nezu cleared his throat. She turned around, and her irritation must have been fairly plain to see since Nezu chuckled before speaking. Now, as much as I would like to allow you time to process everything, I feel that before you go to your son, you should be fully aware about how his classmates feel about him, so that we can avoid any unfortunate misunderstandings. Inko paused for a moment before nodding, and returning to her seat next to a comically bruised All Might. As the Heroics Course students settled into their seats for a movie marathon, each with sufficient pizza on their plates, Izuku also finding himself being pulled into another cuddle pile with the girls, his new girlfriends at the center of the pile around him. He still wasn't convinced he wasn't dreaming that particular fact until he felt a disturbance. Oh no, was the only thought he had time to formulate before everyone present heard an unmistakably motherly voice laced with almost manic levels of excitement shrieked with obvious glee. Grandbabies. All the boys turned pale, feeling sympathetic pangs in their wallets for whoever was responsible for the outburst, while the girls all blushed imagining being the source of such a cry with the green-haired boy in their midst. Inko was striding purposefully towards Heights Alliance dormitories to see her son, while being guided by All Might. She was eager to see her son, if only to help ease her own lingering anxieties. True, she had seen now that he had true friends here at UA, something he had long been overdue. And even the students who hadn't been his friend before didn't treat him any worse than they had before. In fact, they all apologized to him. She was aware how small that act should be but for her son, and herself seeing people actually apologize for hurting him, even on accident once they learned his past diagnosis. Well, it had never happened before, other than All Might. Oh, and apparently, All Might had been trained by the previous holder for a time. Even more shocking was the fact that the seventh holder of the quirk had been her mother, which was something that when she learned both that, and the fact that All Might had in fact been quirkless himself before receiving OFA. Honestly, Tashinori, what did you think Mother would have thought of how you had answered Izuku's question? Especially considering how she evidently responded to your longing to be a hero while quirkless. Tashinori coughed up BLD in shock, looking at her with a flabbergasted expression. That's right, Toshi-san, Nana Shimura was my biological mother. I was an accident, another reason why I don't particularly indulge in alcohol consumption myself, alongside my own ex-husband's antics under the influence. Her tone was severe, though she secretly found great amusement in the man's reactions to her words. Of course, she had turned her attention back to the path ahead of her as she mentioned her ex, subconsciously avoiding his eye, so she didn't see his eyes flare with fury at the mention of the BSDRD's man's infidelity. Shaking her head, she strode a bit faster along the sidewalk, determined to see her son before night had truly settled in. Nezu sighed with relief once Inko, All Might, and Midnight had all vacated his office. Thankfully he had managed to avoid the most severe reactions from her. He shuddered in his seat as he recalled the last time he had mishandled a situation with a woman of that particular family. It was actually part of the reason that the rule that allowed quirkless explicitly to attempt to join the heroics course. He still felt the phantom pains from Nana's argument for changing the rules to allow quirkless. While he would never have turned away a student who fulfilled the criteria of being a genuine hero, he was a big enough chimera to admit that he had missed the fact that the writing of the rules had been misleading. He poured himself another cup of tea to calm himself. Still, again, the meeting had gone as well as one could hope, he reminded himself. Besides, he hadn't forgotten anything important. Right. Nezu. Nezu's BLD ran cold as he heard Izuku's voice laced with, uncharacteristic, for the boy at least, rage. It seemed that the youth had inherited more than OFA from his grandmother. I think it's time I take a tour of the bunkers below UA, to make sure that none of the supplies need replacing, he said to himself. And, having given himself what he knew was a flimsy excuse to preserve his pride, he grabbed a tablet with a specialized handle so he wouldn't drop it, and scurried down a secret passageway. A week out of sight should be long enough to allow the Midoriyas to calm down to safe levels. Right. Hatsume was many things: brilliant, driven, innovative, guaranteed greatness. What Mei was not, however, was overly socially adept. She never really saw the point in social niceties. Why waste time on something superfluous like that, when she could be spending that time inventing her babies? Having said that, she still had friends, people who not only tolerated her idiosyncrasies, but downright enjoyed her company, and hearing her ideas when Power Loader got overly fussy and threw her out of the lab. True, they weren't many. Okay, she only had 2 friends really, and she met her second friend through her first. Her first friend, being none other than Midoriya Izuku. Heroic course, Class 1A's wonderkind, all-around sweet guy. Where was she? Oh yeah, friends. Anyway, her second friend was an older support course student, Melissa Shield. How did she become friends with those two? Not important. Okay, geez, twist her arm, why don't you? So, she met Izuku in the UA Sports Festival, and they teamed up. Honestly, at the time she didn't think much of the guy, except the fact that he showed enough smarts to be worth betting on getting into the next round. However, they met again when Izuku came by after the internships, because he was trying to find out who had made the alterations to his costume. Power Loader recognized her work, and sent Izuku her way. Izuku asked her why she changed his costume. She explained her reasoning, and the rest, as they say, is history. As for Melissa, Izuku introduced the two to each other under the guise of working together on his support gear. They got lost for hours talking shop, exchanged contact information, and now they're long-distance buddies video conferencing once a week. All of this long-winded exposition-y explanation leads up to a point, she promises. Anyway, Mei had heard through the G-Vine that Izuku and some other hero kid, Batsu got in trouble for fighting each other. Supposedly the two had been having beef since the beginning of the school year, and it finally came to a head the previous night, and now both hero students were on house arrest. Now, most people would accept that story without question. Of course, most people are stupid. What can you do? So, Mei, being the good friend that she was, set about collecting information to clear Izuku's name. And as such this afternoon, she had been watching the Heights Alliance dorm security cameras, backing up the footage to go over with Melissa during their scheduled meeting later that night. Justice for Izuku. Free the green bean. And so, with determination, she watched to find evidence to counteract the claims that got her crush best friend in trouble to begin with. Hatsune was going to commit a murder. Scratch that, she was going to commit multiple murders. How dare people do that to her Izuku? To Melissa's Izuku. And why? Because he was Quirkless. Oh ho 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 ho. Oh boy, she was going to hurt All Might, Bakugo and the ... rest in so many new ways they're going to need to invent a whole new language just to describe what she'll have done. It was at this point, May glanced at the clock next to her monitor, wiping away the latest batch of tears. Oh shoot. It was time to have her video call with Melissa. She looked at her monitor bank for a moment, hesitating, even her extremely dulled social awareness making her hesitate on what she was considering doing. She had heard secrets that she wasn't meant to hear, and not just any secrets either. Secrets with the capital S, and italicized, and everything kind of secrets. Was it really her right to share these with Melissa? It was with exactly 5 whole seconds longer deliberation than normal May decided that Melissa deserved to know, so that she could help plan to make Izuku feel better, the way he had made them feel better. Also, it was clear that Izuku wasn't in his right mind at the moment. She would ask for forgiveness later, but for now her friend needed her help, and Hatsune might not be training to be a hero, but she and Melissa would be the best DMN support their hero ever had. At the same time, a certain mad inventor was recovering from her rage and grief-fueled plotting of vengeance in order to call her friend. Izuku was looking up from the movie to see his mom walking into the dorms, trailed by an extremely sheepish-looking All Might who was shooting glances at his mother as if he was a chastised child awaiting judgment. What happened? Izuku thought to himself in shock before he noticed something on his mother's wrist. Huh, that's new. Izuku wondered who made it. You know, it's funny, it almost looks like. After a few seconds, UAS resident Broccoli Boy realized that the bracelet didn't look like anything, because it was a Quirk suppression cuff. Izuku carefully extracted himself from the snuggle pile, his new girlfriends murmuring gently to them, before he walked calmly and quietly out of the dorms, hugging his mother on the way out. Anizuyu. Momo and the others sat dumbfounded staring at the blur of emerald lightning, and, if her boyfriend's voice was anything to go by, pure, unadulterated rage. Looking at the two figures who appeared in the dorm just before Izuku's outburst, Momo realized that one of them was All Might, though she couldn't see anything about him that would have prompted that response towards Nezu from Izuku, nor towards All Might, what with Izuku still defending him. That's alright, Momo and the girls will make sure All Might fully understands his mistakes with their Izuku. Momo slaps hands to her face to regain focus. No, Momo. Revenge isn't heroic, and Izuku wouldn't want you to hurt All Might. Shifting her focus before she looses herself again, she notices that the woman next to All Might looks familiar. Oh, that must be Izuku's mother. But why would seeing her cause Izuku to be mad at Nezu, especially to such a degree? Then Izuku's mother waved her hand. Hello, everyone. I apologize for my son's sudden outburst, she said with a sunshine smile that almost comes close to one of Izuku's own. My name is Midoriya and I am Izuku's mother. Momo was nervous and ecstatic at the same time. She was meeting Izuku's mother. She was going to have to make a good first impression. Looking around, Momo could tell that the same thought was shared amongst all of the other girls. And then something CLC-ked. Momo noticed the bracelet, and she could feel that all of the girls noticed it too, if the palpable rage radiating from all of them was anything to go by. Nezu, indeed. Once she was done introducing herself, Inko paused long enough to gauge the reactions of the other students in her son's class, as well as the, apparently, rival sister class. She noticed that in spite of being supposed rivals, all of the girls from both classes had been gathered around where her son had been before he went to cool his head, as it were. She was mildly pleased to note that they unanimously shared a strong expression when they looked at Toshinori, but were able to school their expressions when both of them had come into the building. She was equally pleased to see the healthy dose of fear mixed with the excitement when they realized who she was. Though it was interesting to note that it was not only the girls she had seen confess to her son who reacted that way. Having decided that she had waited long enough for the information to sink in properly for the girls, she allowed her friendly, motherly smile to turn sharp and predatory. I've come to see my son, but since he's indisposed at the moment, perhaps I should start getting to know his girlfriends. How does that sound? Watching as the expressions on the girls turned from burgeoning rage to sheer panic was an absolute delight. Maybe Nezu had a point. Terrorizing other people's children can be quite satisfying. Now, Inko was a sweet woman, usually. She would give you the shirt off her back, and she adored her son unconditionally. Though sometimes, Inko delighted in utilizing the mind games she was taught back when she was Nezu's personal student. Alright, so, I know that I've been writing this series consistently, and hopefully have been putting out some consistently quality content. However, I wanted to let you all know that I'm going to actually take this series seriously. Now, that's not to say I'm going to start changing how I go about writing the chapters in the future. Putting extra pressure on myself to deliver a specific result has only ever backfired spectacularly. I am, however, going to, in this note, address the characters, how I view them, and how I plan on handling them. First, All Might. No character is really safe in this fic from getting bashed. However, I want everyone to realize that is not the intention of what I have written thus far. At least to my, admittedly limited understanding of what bashing actually is. What I've written has attempted to be genuine reactions of characters who, until the beginning chapters of the fic, had extremely unrealistic and unhealthy views on a man. A fellow human being who, for all their great qualities, does also have faults, trauma and insecurities of their own. Izuku understands this, to an extent, and as is usual for him, hasn't let that knowledge of his mistakes and faults reduce his idolization of the man so far in the fiction. This form of acceptance and idolization has helped stabilize All Might greatly throughout the canon series. However, that same blind idolization leads All Might to with confidence push his own trauma responses, insecurities, and paranoia onto an impressionable boy who is just as traumatized as he is, as well as even more vulnerable than All Might has ever been, with the possible exception of the time around Nana Shimura's death. All Might has demonstrated how deeply that particular event has impacted him quite plainly. However, the way he pushes Izuku and canon further into isolation, through, quite honestly, in my opinion, irrational fear-mongering is unacceptable. Equally as unacceptable to my mind was his pressing the same teenager who had just woken up from a coma to, without meeting anyone again, write a note and run away to fight someone who has, through isolation, repeatedly successfully killed almost all previous holders of OFA. Do I think All Might is an inherently terrible character, or person? No, not at all. Did he need a wake-up call that canon didn't deliver until drastically too late for Izuku's mental health? Yes, he did. As such, I plan on having him speaking with Nezu, Hound Dog, and Izuku at length throughout this fic. Second, Aizawa. Now, do I agree with all of the opinions of how terrible he is as a teacher? To an extent. I can however see how he is also an extremely traumatized man with poor coping skills. Does this in any way excuse what he's done up to this point in the fic? Nope. Does this justify his treatment of his students in canon? Also, another emphatic no. As for the reason I have refrained from bringing down the hammer on Aizawa so far is quite simple. The students have, up to this point, been the primary focal point through which the story has been told, and, unfortunately, they are used to him being a city teacher, and, as morally upstanding students who have as of yet never been given proper counseling or therapy for their many traumatizing experiences since the beginning of the school year. And, equally unfortunately, Aizawa has shown himself to be, at the very least, a competent pro-hero who is extremely protective of his students when danger actually shows up. And it is precisely because of the fact that he shows concern and empathy for them during their tragically frequent traumatic run-ins with the League and other villain groups up to this point that the kids have, effectively trauma-bonded to him. Both of these points lead to a kind of tired acceptance from the students of the bullshit they have had to put up with from Aizawa up until now. Hell, they have even started finding some of the bullshit to be mildly amusing. As for the adults around Aizawa, they don't see the shit he put his students through over the years as clearly as one might think. Primarily because they are all hard and deeply traumatized adults who have trauma bonded over the years, and most of Aizawa's bullshit isn't aimed at them, and as such is deemed much more acceptable than it otherwise would be. Especially since, due to how terrifying Aizawa has made sure he is, I don't imagine most of the teachers have actually had an opportunity to actually hear how damaging what he's been doing is. None of that is helped by the fact that, by the time the students are moved to higher grades, and out of Aizawa's care he's got them convinced that the unhealthy amounts of trauma has made them strong and thus made them proud of the suffering he's put them through. Now though, Aizawa's peers are going to have to deal with seeing in detail exactly how bad he's FCing up with his students. And they, especially the kinder and more empathetic ones, are going to have reactions. It's not going to help things that Nezu is going to play what he said to Midoriya once the teachers have watched what happened in the first couple of chapters regarding Izuku revealing his secrets. That being said, I plan on having Aizawa's issues handled the same way I plan on handling All Might's problems, facing social reprisal, therapy, and going through corrective training on being an educator. Third, in Midoriya. Hopefully this doesn't lead to me getting hate, but there's something that has always irked me about her character. As loving and supportive as she is during the series, she also frequently makes her feelings Izuku's responsibility, something that is a common manipulation tactic, and something often recounted by people who suffer from religious-related trauma. This shows in Izuku's constant guilt and feeling of responsibility over other people's feelings and behaviors. Not only did his middle school teachers make him feel guilty over the abuse he faced at school intentionally, at home, Inko, although most likely accidentally, frequently brings up how worried, scared, or upset she is, frequently also demanding that Izuku thinks about how he is making her feel. While normally this can be a healthy behavior if sparse, or matched with other mitigating factors, Inko shows an unhealthy possessiveness of Izuku that shows she doesn't view him entirely as an actual person. Now, that's as far into her character's negatives as I am going to delve. And even that is going to come with the following warning. Melissa Shield was best described as intelligent and loyal. That's it, she swears. Okay, so maybe she was possibly quirkless, but how else really worried about something like the trait? Deep breaths, Melissa, deep breaths. On another, much more interesting note, it was time for her regular video conference with May. Taking a deep breath, rubbing the tiredness away along with trying to get rid of her frustration over her current difficulties with making progress on the durability, and thus reliability on the full gauntlet she was working on for Izuku. She flipped open her small laptop, and, once she was done loading up the device, she logged into the virtual conference room that she and May had worked on developing together, all the way down to the security protocols for anything shared in the conference room, from their live conversations to any files shared through the internet. Though she had to admit she was personally the most proud of the virus that caused the device that attempted unauthorized access to rick-roll the user at increasing speeds each playthrough until the computer explodes or melts. She had made sure she looked presentable when her friend and fellow member of Izuku's exclusive personal support team appeared on the screen, slightly puffy-eyed, with tears streaming down her cheeks. Now, never let it be said that Melissa didn't love her green-haired friend, but even someone significantly less mentally gifted than May, and herself could see that he had a concerning relationship with his self-preservation instinct. That being, he didn't have one. So, she felt it quite natural for her first question to be a worried and frustrated "what did he do now?" May just shook her head, choking back a fresh sob, as she was clearly trying to hide the evidence of her crying so that she could be presentable. It wasn't what he did, but what was done to him, she said, before she broke down crying again. What happened to Izuku? May. Melissa at this point was starting to tear up as well, fearing the worst. Was Izuku dead? Was May going to tell her about the funeral? May gave a hiccuping, sobbing laugh. No, Mel, no one killed him. Her face started to contort into a pained expression, as she struggled to maintain her composure. It's just watch, Mel, you'll understand. And with that, May fell back into inconsolable tears after she sent a couple of video files to Melissa. Melissa was in tears, and, at this point, it was not just because she was a hopeless, sympathetic crier. No, she had just finished watching the videos. She was heartbroken for multiple reasons. First was the horrific treatment that Izu had been on the receiving end of growing up. The torture he went through, for being quirkless, what Bakugo said. Second, was what All Might, her uncle, had said to Izu. She couldn't help but remember what All Might had said to her. Had he only shown her the consideration he had because of his relationship with her father, would he have handled it the same way he had handled it with Izu if she was a stranger? And third, this whole situation where he was clearly being forced to reveal his secrets for the people around him. Melissa wasn't sure how just yet, but she knew Nezu had something to do with it, and she would find a way to make things uncomfortable for UA. As principal. Now, was she upset that All Might hadn't given her OFA? No, not really. Okay, maybe she would have been angry that All Might hadn't given it to her if it had been revealed before the Camino incident. But it hadn't. She had seen the terrifying power of the Camino villain on her TV, had felt his presence even across the world and watching safely through a TV screen. So, no, she did not want OFA. She couldn't understand how Izu had agreed to taking the power when he had to have been warned about the Camino villain about All for One. Hadn't he? Had he even been warned? Or had All Might believed that he had eliminated the threat, and as such decided to hide AFO's existence in spite of potential copycats, or decedents, or even disciples that could have? And, thinking back on the footage of the incident just before the official newscopters came that was scattered and buried on the net, had come out of the woodwork. She wanted to believe in All Might, at least enough to be able to believe he would have warned Izu. But Melissa couldn't help but remember the scars on Izu's arms, plain evidence of insufficient training on the management and handling of his quirk. How much had All Might actually told Izu before the Camino incident? How much had Izu told All Might before the events in the videos? It was clear that he'd had no reason to trust people, and every reason to hide the truth even before All Might had apparently pressured Izu into handling the stresses of something like OFA and AFO alone, except for using All Might's support network. One thing was made clear: Izu needed all the support he could get, both on and off the field. Dad, I'm going to Japan. Inko looked back over her shoulder to see all of the heroics course girls following dutifully behind her, and she hid a smile as she turned her head back to face the way they were going. She was honestly thrilled with how much support her son had received from his peers in UA even after everything came to light. Something she had taken admittedly a little delight in sicking her son on Nezu over via forgetting to have the quirk-suppressing cuff removed before going to see him. Besides, he was so protective, and if he thought there was even a possibility that she would make the girls uncomfortable, he would do his level best to intercede on their behalf. But Izuku was her son, and as such it was her duty to ensure that he had a happy and healthy relationship. And as such, as much as she wanted to grill each of the girls to make sure they were good enough for her son, to find out why literally all of the heroics course girls were romantically interested in her son. Of course, Izuku had gotten his caring nature from somewhere. Sure, she was protective of Izuku, however she was rapidly starting to come to like the girls as she listens to them talk amongst themselves. And that's why today's meeting was not going to be what she originally planned. May the gods of tea and shipping forgive her. Instead, she brought them to Recovery Girl's office. As she turned around, she gestured to the chairs lining the walls and the beds, blatantly ignoring Recovery Girl's faux stink eye. She knew the old woman loved drama as long as it didn't add to her workload. So, you're probably wondering why I've brought you all to this room in particular. Inko said calmly as she took a seat herself, nodding in thanks as Recovery Girl surreptitiously placed a tissue box next to her elbow. She giggled slightly as she saw the girl's expressions being generally a mixture of being nonplussed and listening attentively. Shaking her head, Inko took a deep breath before she began what she felt she needed to say. So, all of you are interested in a romantic relationship with my son. She didn't phrase it as a question, it wasn't one, and she could tell the girls all knew it. They knew that she knew how they felt about Izuku, and, thankfully, none of them tried to hide it. Good, that would make the next part slightly easier. As such, I felt it necessary to tell you that a fully romantic relationship between Izuku and all of you will probably be impossible right now. Midoriya Izuku was almost an indiscernible blur and streak of lightning, as he shot past Pro Hero, an art history teacher, Midnight, who just watched stunned as he bounced off the wall to take the corner more quickly. And, seeing the crater in the wall, she thanked whatever deities were out there that she wasn't the one Aizawa's problem child was after. She allowed herself to shudder briefly, recalling the near-animalistic fury in the boy's voice as he tore past her, and still echoed through the halls as an early warning system for everyone to get clear of his flight path. Then she started sprinting after him, calling up Ectoplasm as she ran. Midnight to Ectoplasm, I'm probably going to need some backup. We have a student going berserk in the halls. After a brief moment of static that had Nimuri worried that Ectoplasm had failed to get out of the way and gotten taken down by Kid, something she honestly really hoped hadn't happened. Midoriya was a nice, kind boy. He didn't deserve to get kicked out of UA because the principal decided to rile him up. She heard Ectoplasm's voice. You mean Midoriya? Yeah, no. I heard the name, he screamed on his way past, and if Midoriya's mad, I'm sure the lawyers me and the others are arranging will be able to justify whatever he does, so long as he doesn't kill Nezu. Nimuri's steps faltered, as she struggled to catch up with the insane comment from her co-worker, before sighing. If she wasn't going to have backup, then her quirk would not stop the kid going full tilt like he was. She reached up and said, all right, then gather the others, have your clones keep the students out of the way, and get Powerloader to scan the security footage. We need to at least know the why of this. We'll watch the footage of what lead up to this in Conference Room 1. It's been recently swept and cleared of any bugs. Even if they couldn't stop Midoriya, hopefully they could figure out what was going on, and maybe they could also find out why the hero course had been given the month off. Pray for even the smallest miracle, Nimuri. Maybe this time one might occur. She muttered sarcastically to herself as she walked briskly to the meeting. Inko watched each of the girls closely, watching emotions war across each of the girls' faces before Achako, barely suppressed frustration and anger on her face, stepped forward and asked what all of the girls were most likely thinking. I'm sorry, but why not? Inko nodded. She had expected this reaction. After all, on first brush it seemed like she was telling them to stay away from her son, that she didn't approve of their relationship, or potential relationship with Izuku. It was a wrong conclusion to come to, but still, a reasonable one. That said, she was grateful someone had spoken up, had challenged her. Not only would she have been disappointed if, after promising to be there for her boy, they caved in and ran away at the first sign of trouble, but having asked questions, they were now more engaged, and thus more likely to at least hear her words, even if it took her some time and repetitions to make what she was saying sink in. Inko smiled kindly at the girl who had been one of her son's closest friends, and certainly his staunchest supporter since the school year started. I don't mean that I don't approve of your relationship, dear. Quite the opposite, in fact. I hope that it works out for all of you and Izuku. He deserves something really good with no strings attached in his life. She sighed a bit, seeing that the girls were settling down, still confused, but at least now calmed down enough to actually listen to the strong part. What I meant is that, with Izuku's emotional state, even if he accepted all of you, it's entirely possible he did so as a knee-jerk reaction, or feeling as though he had no choice but to accept your feelings, no matter how he felt about the situation. She held up a hand to forestall any interruptions. That is not to say that he doesn't have feelings or won't develop feelings for each of you. However, as he is right now, that's all you girls will have. A relationship where one side feels like they have to give the other everything that is asked of them or risk being selfish, and therefore wrong or even worse, villainous for refusing. She once again scanned the girls' faces as she finished the first part of her explanation, seeing shock, hurt, fear, and many other negative emotions starting to take a DMNT position in the hearts of the girls arrayed before her. She pressed on. This was strong. She was starting to tear up as well, but her son needed this to be said. These girls needed this to be said. So, as much as it hurts, as things are right now, a healthy, loving, romantic relationship is probably impossible, she reiterated before taking a deep breath. However, she smiled as she saw all of them perk up at the word. That does not mean that you should give up on the relationship. What it does mean is that both you and he will have to work at it. It won't be easy, and sometimes you and he will push each other to the breaking point. But he's stubborn, probably too stubborn for his own good. She smiled at the wet chuckles she got in response to that. So, as long as you don't give up on the relationship, he won't either. Her expression hardened, and her gaze became steely. However, the first thing that you need to do, after he finishes venting all his pent-up anger from this week on the wild goose hunt for Nezu, is to make sure that Izuku absolutely understands that he has a say in this relationship you all are trying. That he deserves to have a say in this. She stood up and bowed. If you're willing to put in the work on your end, we adults will make sure that we support Izuku, properly this time, to make sure he starts to heal. As she raised up from her bow, she took in the teary, determined looks the girls were giving her. Once again, Ochako took the lead in the girls' side of the conversation. Don't worry, Mrs. Midoriya, we won't let you, or Izuku down. Right, girls? As the bubbly brunette said the last part, she spun around to face the others who all said at the same time, right. Inko smiled happily. Her son had such wonderful people in his life now. Hopefully, one day, it will make up for everything he went through to get here. After a moment, though, she couldn't help one last bit of mischief before she guided the girls to the dorms to try and sleep. By the way, you girls are planning on including Hatsume-san and Shield-san in this, right? Her voice dripping false innocence as she reveled in the chaos that followed. She was starting to firmly believe, with everyone's help, that her son would come out of this better than he had been in years. Tamura had spent the past 12 hours or so digging up everything he could from the software from those hell pits masquerading as schools. After that is putting up every barrier, both digital and physical, to prevent the computers from sending off a signal back to base. It wouldn't do to be caught out just yet. After all, someone had put a hit on Izuku Midoriya's mother. And he doubted the absolute goons in the Hearts and Minds Party, or even the Denderet Corporation, would pour so many resources into ruining a single individual's life. Not even if they were Quirkless. And so, he was digging for something else. Something beyond the obvious. But what? Sir Night-Eye glared at the screen in front of him as if it had, somehow, personally offended him. Which, given the information displayed on it, it may very well have. Hello to all those who are concerned. Unfortunately, due to the repeated attacks on the first-year heroics course of UA, during their year-to-date, it has been deemed prudent for all heroics courses to delay the work studies program for their first years. For those who have an invested interest in maintaining professional relationships with the students from the later years, they will be continuing to participate uninterrupted. For those who have been eagerly anticipating mentoring the rising stars of the first years, those who have obtained their provisional licenses will be available for recruitment after a PRD of 1 month, during which time the students will be taught emergency procedures and receive field training. Thank you for your understanding. Sincerely, HPSC Liaison to the Chairman of the Board of Heroic Education, Mara. Chairman of the Board of Heroic Education, Nezu. Sir Night-Eye snorted derisively. No doubt a ploy at Toshinori's behest to give his successor one last chance to prepare to avoid making a fool out of himself. Pressing a buzzer, the spindly hero smirked to himself as he said, Bubble Girl, send Lemillion to my office as soon as he arrives. He released the button, ignoring Bubble Girl's sputtered response to the unexpected demand. He then looked back at the file in front of him, showing a young boy with messy green hair, wearing a blazer from one of Mustafu's public junior high schools. Soon, Midoriya Izuku, I will expose your true colors. And then Toshinori will have no choice but to admit Mirio is the one who should have been his successor from the very beginning. Outside Sir Night-Eye's office door, Centipter paused as he was about to knock to deliver some reports as borderline deranged laughter emanated from the room beyond. Sighing, the beleaguered sidekick backed away slowly, before turning and fleeing. Clearly now is a bad time. Somewhere beneath Yue, a sentient creature of indeterminate mammalian nature looked up from his tablet, having finished confirming the letter that would provide UAS first-year heroic students some breathing room to recover emotionally before being moved into the line of duty. He then SWCH over to his hidden camera feed of Sir Night-Eye's office. Ever since All Might's injury, Nezu had noticed that Night-Eye's fanaticism had gotten worse, even in the absence of All Might's company. As such, he'd long since bugged all of the former sidekick's electronics, as well as any major locations the man frequented, to make sure the honestly unhealthy obsession didn't cause any behaviors of a more sinister cast, especially towards Toshinori or anyone he interacted with regularly. Nezu's patience had honestly grown thin with the fanatical fanboy behaviors the man displayed since the beginning of the school year, when, in retaliation for All Might choosing a successor on his own, rather than meeting the young man Night-Eye had groomed meticulously for the role, Night-Eye accidentally let slip All Might's position as a teacher to the local papers, which had allowed the League indirectly to infiltrate the school, which then led to the attack on the USJ. And now it turned out that Night-Eye was trying to expose young Midoriya as exactly who those blatantly falsified school reports from Aldera had painted him to be. Nezu took deep, calming breaths. He felt disappointed. In all honesty, Nezu had only allowed Night-Eye to mentor young Tagada in the hopes that helping to nurture a future hero would help ground the man, and develop respect for someone who was not All Might. Unfortunately, it seemed that being in the know about OFA caused Night-Eye to respond to Mirio's growth in unfortunate ways. Nezu sighed. As much as he disliked souring relations between student and mentor, he would not allow Night-Eye's delusions to create a new vector ferment of young Midoriya during his time in UA. It was time for Mirio and All Might to meet. It was time to put this farce to bed. Kiyama Nimiri was having a long day. Okay, so maybe it was technically 2 days, but who's counting? She walked into the designated meeting room thankful that she listened to Shota telling her, and the others to leave this meeting until the morning. Because, to be honest, no matter what Nezu had done to PSS off Midoriya, if she had held the meeting immediately like she had originally planned, well, as sleep-deprived as she and the others had been last night, especially so for the ones who would have been woken up by her call for the meeting, they probably would have been right behind Midoriya without even looking for evidence. But now they were all rested and, for the most part, in a more rational headspace. Hopefully by the end of the meeting that remained true. Sighing, she sat down as the bots Majima had made specifically for staff meetings rolled around, dispensing each staff member's preferred caffeinated beverage. At least someone knew how to treat a lady. For now, to keep things simple, other than Majima, Inui, and Kan, only the staff members who had a working relationship with both Midoriya and Nezu were called to be present by either herself or ectoplasm. If it was deemed necessary, the others would be brought in at a later date. Looking around, she was startled to note that there were new faces at the table, only one of whom she recognized. Sitting next to Shota, who looked like he would love nothing more than to be anywhere else, sat Emi Fukukato. Blinking rapidly, Nimiri leaned forward about to question the woman's presence when Inui cleared his throat. While I am sure some of you are curious as to the reason our guests here are present, Nezu has asked that any questions you may have be held until after the meeting is over. Looking up at everyone present, he sighed, and Nimiri noted the bags under his eyes, how the man seemed to have aged since she last saw him. Shaking his head, Inui continued. Also, while the meeting was originally to determine the source of one Midoriya Izuku's rage against Nezu, and exactly how much support would be prudent to provide Midoriya on his crusade, he sighed, massaging his temples before continuing. It has been deemed prudent to provide context of Midoriya's records as well as an accounting of his actions since the beginning of the year for those who are new to the faculty to be brought to the same page. After saying that, he passed out folders to each of his co-workers, diligently avoiding looking in Nimiri's direction, likely knowing she would be shooting him a stink eye for co-opting a meeting she had called, and normally she would be doing so. However, she was curious, what exactly could she and the others stand to gain from this? Didn't they already know everything about Midoriya? It wasn't like he could keep a secret to save his life. Once all the folders were passed out, Inui nodded to Majima, who started typing on a laptop in front of him for a moment, until a holographic image of Midoriya that had probably been captured on the security cameras the day after the provisional license exams, juxtaposed with a picture of Midoriya Nimiri had never seen before. This Midoriya looked frail and scared. Then she noticed the dates for the 2 photos. Nimiri took a steadying breath. She wasn't going to like this at all, was she? Looking down, she opened the folder. She noticed that it contained what appeared to be the records of both Bakugo and Midoriya from their time in middle school. Confused, she glanced back up at Inui, who just shook his head and gestured back at the folder. With a sinking feeling, she focused on what was written within. That couldn't be right. There was no way this was Midoriya. Looking up angrily at Inui, Nimiri opened her mouth when Zashi beat her to the punch. What's the meaning of this? He said, voice low and quiet. The newcomers looked confused at the expressions of the others around the table. What's wrong? Emi asks, looking between Shota, whose fist is clenched on the table, to the others who clearly knew the boys in the folder, growing more agitated as they read. I mean, yeah, it's SCK to know that one of your kids used to stir up trouble, but he's shaped up, hasn't he? There was a brief pause as everyone measured each other, the old gauging the new, and vice versa. Deciding that she wasn't going to ever have enough coffee or liquor to deal with this properly, Nimiri spoke up. The problem is, these files are the exact opposite of the students that are being reported on. Emi hissed, as one of the strangers spoke up, their voice familiar, but the distortion making it strong to be sure. What do you mean? They asked, definitely male, younger side of adult. Nimiri studied him for a moment. The young man sat in a heavily stylized wheelchair that enclosed his lower body, the segmented paneling giving it a futuristic look, blending with the upper body having a distinct armor design. Why did it look so familiar? Oh, that was going to eat at her until she figured it out. Nimiri shook her head to focus before answering. None of the reported behaviors for Midoriya match what he's shown since he arrived on campus for the entrance exams. Meanwhile, Bakugo matches each of the complaints leveled against Midoriya nearly to a T. Inui chose that moment to speak up. It gets even better, read the registered Quirk section as well as the name of the middle school the 2 boys came from. Nimiri looked, and then she swore, as did everyone else in the room. Everyone except, she noticed, Shota. He knew something. Midoriya Izuku had been registered as quirkless, but he had a quirk. How? And then she remembered the Namu. Ice flooding her veins, she looked up, scanning the room, seeing almost everyone looking a mix of shock and then growing outrage. She couldn't help but wonder if everyone else had come to the same conclusion she had. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Shota watching everyone else closely. What did he know? As it became clear that there was about to be general outrage, Inui spoke up again. Before any of you ask, you are not being shown this because Midoriya Izuku is suspected of being the traitor. If you look at the file, you will notice that his school was one Aldera Middle School. and suddenly it felt like a sledgehammer had struck Nimiri in the chest. Aldera, that was the school that Nezu had been investigating for child abuse, neglect, and worse, for her head whipped down towards Midoriya's files: quirkless children and children with undesirable quirks. As for the second reason we know that Midoriya is not the traitor, we know exactly how he went from being quirkless to having the quirk he does now. Inui continued, before he pulled out a stack of papers and a bundle of pens. However, before we disclose anything more, all people present will be required to sign an QENDA. Nimiri's head was swimming from the roller coaster she was on. A quirk-enforced non-disclosure agreement. What was this secret? She looked at the paper with dread. The only reason anyone could issue a quirk-enforced contract was if it was directly and indisputably linked to someone's health and safety. As such, usually such documents were only used by courts and the higher levels of government when discussing national secrets or reviewing cases of people and witness protection when there were extremely dangerous individuals or organizations that it was not certain could otherwise be guarded against involved. She then looked up at the pictures of Midoriya, and her resolve firmed. She was scared of whatever she would learn, but Midoriya was one of her students, and as a teacher and a hero she would do everything in her power to protect him. Tagata, report to All Might's office before departing for your work studies if you could. Thank you. The classroom stirred, chattering in confusion as they shot Mirio with confused, and in the case of his two closest friends, concerned and at the same time excited expressions. Mirio himself was at a loss. Why would All Might want to speak to him? Though one thing was clear. With all these questions there was only one way to get answers. Mirio would apologize to Sir later. Right now, he had a meeting with All Might. Mirio knocked on the door to the teacher's offices, feeling uncharacteristically nervous. But, come on, this was All Might. Who wouldn't be freaking out right now? Okay, sure, All Might taught heroics once a week. But this was All Might asking to speak to him one-on-one, in person. Deep breaths, Mirio. Maybe he should go through this meeting using his Lemillion persona. Would that be easier? Maybe. So lost in his thoughts was Mirio that he didn't notice the door open until he heard the voice of the now retired #1 hero, young Tagata. Thank you for taking the time to come see me. Maybe, in another life, Mirio would have noticed how All Might was shaking just as badly as Tamaki during social interactions, or around people in general. In this life though, he was too busy trying to stop shaking himself. It is my pleasure, All Might Sensei. Although, I can't help but wondering why you wanted to speak with me. At this point, Mirio started trying to calm himself with slow, deep breaths as subtly as possible. All Might shook his head, gesturing for Mirio to follow him. Not out here, young Tagata. As much as the ship has sailed for both the faculty and the first-year heroic students at this point, I still want to try to limit the spread of information on this as much as possible. Well, that got Mirio's attention. Sobering up, Mirio quickly followed All Might into his office. Once they were inside and All Might had sat at his desk, he gestured for Mirio to take the seat opposite him. Once Mirio was seated, he was left under the contemplative and evaluative gaze of the retired pro. After a moment, All Might closed his eyes and sighed. I suppose I should start at the beginning. It all started back at the dawn of Quirks, with two brothers. It had been a few minutes since Toshinori finished explaining the history of All for One and One for All, and young Tagata hadn't moved a muscle the entire time. Finally, the young man looked up at the retired pro, a contemplative look in his eyes. So, there was an ancient Quirk, born from a villain with an even older Quirk trying to force a stockpiling Quirk onto his younger brother. And now, hundreds of years later, you have it. The fledgling hero seemed reasonably skeptical. Toshinori simply nodded his head. I am the 8th wielder of OFA, yes, he said. Mirio nodded his head before returning to a contemplative pose. Did this have anything to do with your falling out with Sir? Toshinori could only nod somberly. Roughly 6 years ago, in a fight I had thought at the time had led to the death of AFO, I was severely injured. Murai argued that I should pass on OFA immediately and retire. I refused, leading to a terrible argument, and are going our separate ways. Toshinori sighed. He knew that Nezu blamed Murai for the break-in and the subsequent USJ incident, and hoped Toshinori would use this opportunity to destroy young Tagata's relationship with the man. However, Toshinori had his doubts about his former sidekick's involvement. Sure, the man could be petty and hold a grudge, but surely he wouldn't endanger the lives of innocent children just for some petty revenge, would he? Still, with how deeply involved Murai had already gotten the boy, and evidently planned to drag him in deeper, the least Toshinori could do would be to give the youth all of the facts. Straightening up, he looked at the boy, no, the young hero in front of him. Around this time, almost 2 years ago now, my injuries had aggravated due to my stubborn refusal to rest or take it easy, to the point where I could only perform my duties as All Might for about 3 hours a day. At that point I had to face the music, for the sake of maintaining the peace both I and my predecessors had fought so strong for. It was time for me to find a successor. As such, I arranged with Nezu to become a teacher in order to both train the next generation of heroes, and find the one who would be worthy of inheriting my power. Toshinori watched as young Tagata connected the dots. But then, you don't have OFA anymore, do you? Toshinori shook his head. Life has a funny way of dismantling even the most carefully laid plans. You see, 6 months later, as I was familiarizing myself with the Mustafu area when a particular villain decided to try to rob a nearby convenience store. Naturally, I gave chase, only to lose the criminal in the sewer systems, as I had already gotten near my time limit for the day, meaning I had to give part of my chase in my civilian form. He watched as he spoke, a small part of him enjoying the rapt attention his audience, while also dreading how the boy would react to what was going to come next. Yamada Hisashi was a loud, upbeat, slightly goofy, energetic man. This often led people to misinterpret him as being immature or socially dense, even his closest friends sometimes forgetting that he too was able to be serious when the situation called for it. This usually suited him just fine. After all, the world was dark enough as it was, so he relished the opportunity to lighten the mood whenever he could. That being said, even with years of practice, Hisashi found himself at a loss for words with worrying frequency since the start of the school year. And now, here he was, his whole worldview knocked out of alignment. Although he should have expected something to this degree when Inui whipped out QE contracts, he had already started to feel horrible for doubting the little listener, Midoriya's character, when he found out the school the boy came from. Honestly, even if the kid had been a spy for the League, after what Hisashi had heard from Nezu when the Chimera had been starting the investigation, well, he doubted he wouldn't have turned to villainy after going through something like that. Shaking his head, he refocused on the main issue. Midoriya wasn't a spy for the League of Villains. In fact, he was until recently their prime target for elimination. Even more insane, which Hisashi wouldn't have thought possible before today, the kid was also the latest inheritor of both an ancient super Quirk, as well as a just-as-old war between an immortal monster masquerading as a human and the previous holders of the Quirk. He massaged his temples, as he once again fought down the urge to burst Yaga's eardrums. After all, even if you think the big bad evil guy is dead, it's still not cool to offer AFC King Child the DMN Quirk without at least telling him about the BSDRD. Deep breaths, Sashi, deep breaths. Midoriya had already gotten that taken care of, if the bruises he saw on Yagi when the two passed last night was any indication. Refocusing on Inui, he waited for the meeting to be adjourned, only for his hopes that was all the surprises for the rest of the day to be dashed. Now that we have the source of Midoriya's quirk covered, it's time for all of you to learn his history. Following that, we will discuss why the first-year Heroics course students are on a 1-month academic leave, as well as why both Yagi and Aizawa are on probation for the duration of that leave. Following that, we will cap it off with why Midoriya was raging through the halls hunting for Nezu in a rage, and why it was deemed inadvisable to interfere. Tashinori was right, young Tagada was not taking it well. And another thing, just because a quirkless kid couldn't necessarily be a hero like you doesn't mean he couldn't be a hero. Haven't you been paying attention to the studies of the evolution of quirklessness? The presence of quirks makes even a single generation of humanity the evolutionary equivalent of 6 for other species. Even if a quirkless person was basically powerless back when you were a kid doesn't mean they would be now. These days, humans even without strength enhancement quirks can train to match those who do have minor strength quirks. Tashinori sighed as he settled in. This was going to be a long tirade, but young Tagada had a right to vent, even if the exact statistics he was quoting were slightly inaccurate. He had seen young Midoriya lift and throw a car near the end of his strength training. After all, more than double the record for an untrained minor strength enhancement quirk, dismissing Yaga's own preconceptions of quirkless people's capabilities. By that point though, he had been too focused on training the boy to inherit OFA to really put too much thought into it. He rubbed his forehead, yet another thing he needed to apologize for. Honestly, at this point he was looking forward to seeing Hound Dog for his therapy sessions. It might be strong, and even painful, but if it meant he would come out of it a better teacher for his students, he would gladly take on the burden. But for now, he needed to focus back into young Tagada's tirade so he could properly address the salient points before moving on to the rest of his and young Midoriya's story. Tensei rubbed his face as best as he could with his helmet in place. Hound Dog had just finished playing the security footage where Midoriya Izuku, one of his younger brother's friends, had been forced to divulge his experiences as a quirkless at Aldera Middle School. He sighed silently, wishing that the League hadn't demolished the district's school buildings, if only so he could indulge in his own unheroic impulses towards the school after what he had heard. Although there was one thing that stuck out to him in particular in the kid's recounting. Imagine the kindest teacher there was Aizawa-sensei after he had decided that you had no potential, and then got told by Nezu that he couldn't expel you. Shouta, what did you do? Looking across the table, he noticed that both Nem and Zashi were having the same thoughts as they stared at their shared insomniac friend. Hound Dog cleared his throat, growled, took a deep breath, and cleared his throat again. Now that we have covered Midoriya's time before UA, we're going to cover his time to RRing, all the way up until the time of this RR recording. Arira. Tensei looked down at his new hero suit and wheelchair. Both were a gift from my island, to help him get back into the heroics game. He didn't even know the kid, and yet Midoriya had gone out of his way to try and give Tensei his life back simply because he was his friend's brother. He clenched his fist. I swear, Midoriya, for as long as I'm here I'll help you and your friends become the best heroes you can be. And I said, young man, you too can become a hero. After that, I offered young Midoriya OFA. Mirio sat there, thinking over everything he had heard, unable to feel like he still hadn't gotten the full story. Something he was beginning to suspect was a bad habit of All Might's. After all, there was still one major question that hadn't been answered. All right, but one thing's bothering me. All Might perked up, rousing himself from his own thoughts. Why me? Why are you telling me any of this? All Might sighed as he adjusted himself in his chair. The reason I'm sharing all of this with you, young Tagata, is so that you have some context for what I am about to tell you and show you next. Mirio nodded and gestured for the man to continue. You see, that same day, as soon as I had made sure young Midoriya had made it home safely, I called up Murai to tell him that I found my successor. Only to have him, once I told him who it was, to shout at me what I had said to young Midoriya on the rooftop, and much more besides. Mirio reeled back as All Might sighed again, massaging his temples. You see, young Tagata, while I was busy trying to keep going for as long as I could, it seems Murai had gotten it into his head that he should then be the one to choose my successor. And as such, he chose you, and then he started training you for OFA before finally telling me he had found a candidate and demanded I meet you. Around the same time I agreed to Nezu's proposal to teach at UA. Shaking his head, All Might continued. Even so, I wouldn't have brought you in on this, except it seems that Murai has decided to try to force the issue. He turned a computer monitor to face Mirio. It seems that Nezu has been keeping an eye on those outside UA who knew about OFA in case anything happens. Unfortunately, he received some footage from your mentor's office that convinced him to press me to bring you in on the secret. Without another word, All Might opened a video file. Smack. Honestly, Shouta should have expected it. But even so, he couldn't help but feel shocked. Not the fact that he had been slapped, he'd been bracing himself for Nimiri to do something similar. No, what had shocked him was that Joke had slapped him. Holding his face, he turned to her. How could you? She cried out in outrage, the other newcomers seemingly equally upset by what they had heard him say to Midoriya during the Quirk comprehension tests at the beginning of the school year. Before he could say anything, Nezu spoke up over a speaker on the table. Please, refrain from striking your co-workers, and hold all questions until the end. Thank you. Gritting her teeth, Joke sat back into her seat, arms crossed with a scowl on her face to match one of Shouta's best. Shouta sighed. This was not going to get better any sooner. As soon as the meeting was over, Nimiri's folder holding Midoriya's files was full of marks as Inui finished speaking. In conclusion, Midoriya has a martyr complex and, more than likely, a lack of trust in teachers, and as of last year, even pro-heroes. Needless to say, this is a delicate situation. As such, while you will need to be careful with Midoriya, you should not treat him noticeably differently than you have, or for the newbies, how you would teach any of his peers. Furthermore, once appropriate action towards Bakugo has been decided, to avoid causing Midoriya any further distress on the issue, that will be it. Do not engage in any behavior that is more hostile than you would have before learning all of this. That is all. As soon as he had finished speaking, he, along with Shouta, got up and left, probably to avoid any further questions. As she looked around, she saw the shell-shocked expressions on her fellow co-workers. It was at this point that Zashi spoke up and said what she was pretty sure they were all thinking. Well, this is FC King fantastic. Mirio sat on a bench in the hall near the cafeteria, staring blankly at the wall across from him. A part of him knew he should be on his way to his work study with Sir. Sir wouldn't like tardiness after all. But, after what he'd heard, what he'd seen Sir say, he couldn't currently bring himself to care what Sir would like. Would he continue with his work studies with Sir after what he learned? Maybe. Right now, he needed time to think things through, and so, he shot Bubble Girl a message to let her know Nezu and All Might held him up, and what they were asking for help with would probably take at least the rest of the day. A part of him knew how Sir would interpret it. He would think that All Might had decided to give him OFA, at least that's what he would think if his currently shown thinking pattern held true. He knew that would get Sir to give him as much breathing room as he could want to adjust to his new quirk. And he felt disgusted with himself for even indirectly insinuating he took away one of his Kuhai's futures for his own gain. He leaned back, head thudding gently against the wall, memories of the security footage of Midoriya's unwilling soul-bearing sessions cycling through his mind on repeat. The little guy had been through so much and still wanted to help people. Even after being told to, and then All Might, Mirio's vision began to blur as his eyes began to water. Would Mirio still want to help people after going through what Midoriya had? Knowing what he did, he wasn't so sure he would. And so, he sat and pondered. He wasn't sure how long he'd been doing that, but at some point, Tamaki and Nejair found him. Hey, Mirio, what are you doing here? Weren't you supposed to go on your work studies with Night Eye? Nejair asked, floating up to him and looking at him like a lost puppy. Mirio normally would have laughed heartily at her antics, but not this time. He let out a soft chuckle, giving Nejair a soft brotherly smile. She'd been one of his closest friends since UA began, especially since she was one of the few people who was willing to help Tamaki out of his shell. The three had rapidly become like siblings. Seeing his subdued response, Tamaki sat down next to Mirio, and head still pointed towards the floor, spoke in his usual gentle, quiet voice. What's the matter, Mirio? What All Might say? Instantly Nejair's mood turned thunderous. I swear if he hurt you. Mirio instantly sat bolt upright. calm down, Nejair. He pleaded it wasn't me who was hurt. And, apparently that was not the right thing to say. Who? Mirio almost clammed up hearing Tamaki's voice. He'd almost forgotten that a high-ranking pro mistreating a civilian would be a sore subject after he had worked with Fatgum on that case. About 2 weeks after they'd gotten their provisional licenses, Fatgum had brought him on. Apparently the pro had been working on a case where another hero had been using their position to throw their weight around with the civilians under their jurisdiction. Mirio still didn't know the details, but judging from Tamaki's reaction just now, it was bad. Apparently, one of the two first years who had gotten into a fight had been a bully of the other. The victim had, I've been told, met All Might in the past when they'd been misdiagnosed as quirkless. He looked at his hands as he spoke. It was uncomfortable to lie to these two, even by omission. But this wasn't his story to tell, and he already worried that he was oversharing. As both of his friends hissed in sympathy, he continued, his voice turning bitter at the last word. Apparently, when asked, All Might told him that he couldn't be a hero without a quirk. Tamaki growled, I swear, the next time I see All Might. Tamaki, Nejair reprimanded with unusual sharpness, before turning back to Mirio, ignoring the blue-haired boy's defiant glare. Are you okay, Mirio? You can stop if you want to, you know. Mirio just nodded jerkily before taking a shaking breath and continued. Long story short, the little guy found out he wasn't quirkless during the last 2 minutes of the entrance exam. And while All Might had evidently been helping him train his body for the exam as part of an apology for what he said, he feels guilty that he hasn't been able to help the kid with his new quirk, so he was asking me if I could spare some time this month to help him get a better handle on it. He rubbed his face before looking up at his two friends, noting that Tamaki was still vibrating with silent rage, and Nejair was discharging energy randomly, a sure sign that she was livid. After a beat he sighed and, hoping to distract them, said, Needless to say, there's a lot about his history that I didn't tell you. However, I wanted to know if you wouldn't mind helping me to train him when you have days off of your work studies. Tamaki nodded, relaxing a little, while Nejair cheered. Of course, you can count on us. Tamaki chuckled, shaking his head. You're taking the first month off to help him, aren't you? Mirio rubbed the back of his head embarrassedly. Am I that obvious? Nejair smiled fondly at him. It's sweet. You're doing this because he reminds you of your cousin, aren't you? Mirio nodded, thinking back to when his own cousin was diagnosed as quirkless last year. Naturally, she had been crushed, as so many kids who had dreamed about being a hero would have been at the news. Of course, the long distance made frequent visits impractical, so the soonest he had been able to see her was 6 months later. It was a strong 6 months hearing about how everyone was trampling on her dreams. But it also gave Mirio time to do research. He studied quirk theory and stumbled upon the studies of quirkless evolution. With what he learned, he was able to convince her parents to get her tested for secondary mutations. And, with that information in hand, he was able to get the retiring heroics teacher of that year, Arkham, to come up with a training regime for her. All that said, he was happy to have all the tools necessary to turn the promise behind his hero name into a bit more of a reality. Kid, you can be a hero, but you're going to have to work strong for it. Since then, her parents moved into town and he spent every weekend training her for her dream. Looking Nejair in the eye, Mirio clenched his fist and smiled. What kind of hero would I be if I don't? All Might may have started this rescue when he trained the guy, but it's pretty clear his heart's still back with his tormentors. Standing up, he raised his fist as he walked down the hall. A hero's job is about saving the heart just as much as it is about saving the body. Let's go, let a suffering Kuhai know that we are here. Behind him, Nejair and Tamaki smiled at his retreating back, then at each other before they leapt to follow him, saying in unison, right. In the back of his mind, Mirio remembered a little blonde boy whose permeability quirk had been mocked for being worse than useless. He would be DMN before he let anyone else believe something like that about themselves when he was around. While Mirio and his friends went looking for Izuku, he was waking up to a rather concerning if confusing reality. Blinking blearily, Izuku sat up, feeling something heavy and metallic slide into his lap. Eyes snapping open, Izuku looked around wildly, hands gripping the metallic object. Izuku's breathing became rapid and shallow until he heard a familiar voice coming from the corner of the room. Oh good, you're awake. Izuku's head whipped around to look towards the source of the voice. Seeing a appealing girl with pink dreadlocks standing up from her desk, he relaxed, his suspicions confirmed. May, why am I in your lab? Then he looked at what he was holding, and nearly choked in his shock. And why am I holding a gun? Instead of cackling, as was her norm, she crossed the room to the cot he was sitting on quickly and pulled him into a hug. No matter what happens, you know you can count on Mel and I, right? She asked him, tears audible in her voice. Stunned, Izuku just nodded and returned the hug awkwardly. Sniffing, May pulled back and patted him on the shoulder and said, good. Before clearing her throat and, voice starting to return to normal, said, now, you're here because this is the room you passed out next to. You have a gun because I heard you screaming the principal's name just before you crashed and thought paints would be an appropriate punishment for whatever he did. Izuku slumped back down onto the cot and sighed. Never change, May. He muttered to himself with fond exasperation. Unaware of Izuku's fully automatic plight, Mirio looked back to his friends and asked, by the way, I noticed that you two reacted really strongly to what I said at the beginning. Mind telling me why? Tamaki and Nejiru looked at each other, communicating silently before shrugging. Tamaki turned back to Mirio. Truth is, we've met one of the kids who got into trouble over that fight a few days back. Midoriya Izuku. Nejiru nodded energetically. Yeah, I still can't believe that Zukun would do something like that. He was really nice when we talked. Tamaki took over, pointedly ignoring Nejiru's habit of nicknaming people she barely knew. In fact, he's helped us both a few times and we were thinking about starting to hang out with him before he got house arrest. Nejiru jumped in at that point, shaking her fists in frustration so violently that she started bouncing. Which is super unfair. Zukun would never start a fight. Tamaki just sighed, making it obvious that they'd had this argument before. Nejiru, we've been over this before. Being kind doesn't mean he wouldn't start a fight with someone. Mirio chuckled, shaking his head and pointedly ignoring the feelings of guilt starting to bubble up. If I hadn't been training so strong with Sir, would I have missed out on these stories? Have I been a bad friend? As a matter of fact, he wasn't the one who started the fight. Turns out he was just unwilling to let the other guy take all of the blame. He informed them. While it was still technically another secret for Izuku to decide to share or keep, he felt All Might had told him that as he left for a reason. Besides, if it helped his friends have a positive impression of the kid they'd be helping to train, then he'd take responsibility for sharing it gladly. Nejiru jumped up, pumping her fist in victory, while Tamaki just shook his head amusedly, returning to the topic at hand. Point is, he helped me a few times when I was feeling overwhelmed by underclassmen starting after the sports festival. He smiled embarrassedly as he continued. As you know, my social battery was already spent from being on stage and I was honestly about to have a meltdown. And then all of a sudden a green blur appeared between me and the others, and then Midoriya started asking the second years for directions to Nezu's office. He was shaking so bad it was obvious he was just as nervous about the situation as I was, but he used field sign behind his back to clue me in and let me make my escape. Nejiru jumped in without missing a beat. As for me, he happened to come by when I was in the middle of one of my depressive slumps. She blushed and started tapping her fingers together. Rather than bombard me with questions, he just left a warm cup of tea, a CD and soft mittens next to me with a note that he was available to talk if I wanted. She was fully red now and started curling up into herself as she said, I've been talking to him whenever I've been in a bad way and you guys are busy ever since. He's just so sweet and... She started muttering as she floated in place, her energy blasts causing her to gently spin in place. Nodding along with her story, Tamaki took over. That's why we got so upset about what we heard. Nejiru rallied herself quickly and said, especially since it took a bit to fully process that a bully was in UA. And the hero course no less. Tamaki nodded, mutely fiery rage in his eyes. Nejiru's eyes watered as she zoomed up to Mirio's face. Was the blonde kid really Zukun's bully Mirio? Mirio nodded grimly. He was, but the situation is delicate, and I think you should let Midoriya tell you his story himself. Then he looked at Nejiru with mock sternness. In his own time. That's his story and more than enough people know it without his permission. He should at least be allowed to decide if it spreads further. So, no pressuring him. With that said, Mirio turned on his heel and resumed walking. Now, let's go find a potential new friend. Melissa looked out over the city, having just finished her morning routine after waking from a jet lag-induced slumber. She stretched, grateful that she had taken the flight when she did so she could make it to Japan without significant interruption to her sleep schedule. She applied a patch that helped mitigate the effects of jet lag and walked towards the exit, lifting her already packed suitcase as she went. Hang on, Izuku, I'm coming. Never change May. May couldn't help but giggle silently as she heard Izuku's response to what she had said. Even as she returned to what she had been working on, glancing at the tablet she had propped up discreetly to the side as she continued to work on her latest baby, she glanced at the security footage on Nezu's personal network, a security system devoted entirely to monitoring the tunnels that Nezu frequently used to get around, or in this case, hide from the wrath of the boy currently relaxing behind her. Glancing at it, she saw Nezu hiding in his personal bunker, noting with some amusement an assortment of crates labeled in the appropriate forest green, in case of an angry Midoriya stamped on the sides, as well as on the sturdy-looking metal door. Looking closer, she noticed that he was currently indulging and growling at what appeared to be security footage of Bakugo sulking on a cot. May felt her fingers twitch, as a dozen ideas FLC curled through her mind before she shook her head, dislodging the thoughts. Izuku came first. Turning her head partially to glance over her shoulder, she called to him. Do you want me to help you find Nezu? She asked it, fully expecting him to deny the offer, possibly even saying something heartbreaking about not wanting to be a burden. What she got, however, was something unexpected, if no less concerning. I mean, maybe. She glanced sharply at the green-haired youth, looking closely at his eyes. I mean, I'm still angry at him for what he did to my mom, but... He shrugged, and she could see how tired his eyes were even though he had just woken up. I'm pretty sure my mom showed me that Quirk suppression cuff to get me chasing Nezu so she could give my girlfriends the shovel talk. It was official, Zuku was emotionally tired. He was only ever this candid when he just had no more left to give, usually after Aizawa pulled one. Rational deception too many, and he needed to go back to bed and just crash for the foreseeable future. Turning around fully, May brushed a pink lock behind her ear and laughed lightly, typing a request on her wrist-mounted digital assistant to Nezu's personal tablet to get Mel permissions to enter UA premises indefinitely. That does seem like something she'd do, she agreed, laughing lightly. Smiling at the affirmative response she got from the rodent, she decided that maybe he'd earned a stay of execution. For now. Hey, Zuku, the girls are probably going to be waking up soon worrying about you. Why don't you head back to the dorms and make them something nice for breakfast? The clenching pain in her chest eased slightly when Zuku distractedly nodded and mumbled, that sounds like a great idea, May, before rolling off the work table turncoat and caught himself heavily on his feet. Awesome, Mel and I will be by in a bit. We have something important to discuss with the others, she said nonchalantly, knowing that would at least wake him up enough to make it to the dorms safely. Sounds good, May. Wait, did you say Mel's coming? And just like that, a spark of life returns to his emerald eyes. May laughed at his reaction. Of course, Zuku, you didn't think I would hear what you said yesterday and not drag Mel over, did you? Seeing his panic-stricken face, May sobered a bit. Walking over to her crush, she placed a hand gently on each shoulder, grimacing internally when he flinched at her touch. Listen, Izuku. He looked up at her, and her heart broke all over again, seeing the vulnerable fear and absolute exhaustion evident in his expression. I meant what I said, okay? Mel and I are here for you. No matter what. Understand? He just sniffled, eyes watering, and her heart clenched again when she saw him almost start to shake his head no, before hesitating and nodding rapidly as he threw his arms around her, sobbing desperately. May patted the young hero's back, holding him firmly, repeating, no matter what, Zuku, no matter what. Toru woke up, head P&D from both lack of sleep and crying. She rubbed her eyes as she worked her mouth, trying to get the weird, dry, cottony feeling to go away. Stupid feelings, making me feel things. She grumbled internally as she tried to get up, only to find herself pinned under something. Looking down, she saw that she had been entangled in the most dastardly of social inventions, the dreaded cuddle pile. Giggling silently at the most inside of jokes, Toru worked to gently extricate herself from the pile of her sleeping female classmates, carefully avoiding stepping on any of them. It was only when she had succeeded in her daring escape that the invisible girl allowed herself to think about how she had wound up both in a cuddle pile and crying. The girls had all made it back to the dorms when they received a text from May that Izuku had finally worn himself out and passed out near her lab. Toru wasn't sure if it was the relief of finding out her boyfriend was okay, or the emotional turmoil of the rest of the day's events, but she broke down into tears and collapsed to the floor. It wasn't even a moment before all of the other girls glomped onto her, or each other likewise, breaking down as they finally were allowed to just stop and think. Cries of Deku, poor Izuku, and Green, or Midoriya, could be heard most clearly from the mingled wails of empathetic distress. Mercifully, the day had been too emotionally draining to allow it to go on at max volume for very long, and, although slowly, the girls had dropped off one by one, sniffling and rubbing away their tears as best they could before burrowing deeper into the cuddle pile. Eventually Toru was the last one awake, her voice long gone from her wailing. But soon, she joined the others in a troubled sleep. Sighing, Toru rubbed the sleep from her eyes and looked around before freezing. This wasn't the common room. It looked similar, but, looking around, she noticed both the similarities as well as the differences. First, the carpet was a few shades darker, making it match the green of Izuku's hair. Second, it was a bit cozier. Struggling to figure out what gave the space that feeling, she realized that the wooden parts of the decor was a deeper redder brown than it had previously been. Looks like Nezu's trying really strong to appease Izuku, she thought. Giggling quietly, she started to explore the space to see what other goodies the principal had slipped in while they were asleep. She made it as far as the windows before she smelled it. That heavenly mouth-watering scent. Breakfast, she squealed internally as she raced silently towards the source. Toru arrived around the corner to see who was cooking. As she came around the corner, she stopped dead in her tracks as she saw a scene that had her pinching herself to make sure she wasn't dreaming. Standing in front of the island that matched the color scheme of everything else with emerald-colored marble, light reflecting off of UA in the distance caused messy emerald hair to take on an almost ethereal glow at the edges. Plating pancakes, he looked up and right into her eyes. Exhausted emerald orbs focused entirely on her eyes, cheeks starting to take on a red tint. And just like that, she's reminded all over again about how she started to fall for this boy. Morning, Toru, how do you feel about pancakes? Morning, Toru, how do you feel about pancakes? The familiar voice drew Kayuka to wakefulness, words and tone combining beautifully to entice her into action. Even so, the punk rocker defied the siren call, until her mind, rousing rebelliously in spite of her determination to return to sleep, noticed something off about the voice. Earphone jacks twitched and rose independently, seeking out the source of the voice in an effort to pinpoint the difference. A giggle, bright and airy, though tinged with something almost alien to the voice. I feel like that would be wonderful, Izuku. There it was again. What was that note? And then, Kayuka remembered what it sounded like. The same tones and timbres heard properly for the first time only the night before. Sadness. Toru was sad again. Well, that just wouldn't do. Gently rousing herself the rest of the way, Kyoyuka rose, careful to avoid waking the others, and silently grateful that she had been at the edge of the cuddle pile. She turned, still not awake enough to be concerned with her aloof affectations or image in the face of one of her friends needing comfort. All right, I'll dish you up some in just a moment. Would you like anything else? And there she heard it again. Her brain, more awake than before, recognized the voice as Green's, but yeah, it sounded tired, but this was different. This was more than just the average kind of tired. She cursed her social anxiety for making her less familiar with her boyfriend's mannerisms. Only if you let me help. Toru's voice sounded from near where the kitchen was. Plodding in that direction, deciding that coffee sounded good, the perplet started to take in her surroundings, Jax leading the way like dowsing rods. Was there something different about the common room? She heard Green chuckling, and there it was again. It was going to drive her insane if she didn't figure it out. As she bemoaned taking so long to wake up fully, Kyoyuka finally rounded the corner and saw the boy she'd been enamored with since she saw him cleaning that beach. And then she looked at his eyes, and suddenly, coffee wasn't quite as important anymore. Izuku's eyes just looked so tired. And oh, if that particular type of exhaustion wasn't familiar. Oh, hey, Kyo, I'm making pancakes. Want some? Melissa cruised down the street in a car that was specially designed by her dad. AI assistance to help account for cultural differences with driving practices, very convenient, especially since Melissa didn't have a license of her own. Thankfully, she was a fully internationally licensed support technician. As such, she was able to smooth things over the couple of times she was pulled over by showing her ID and explaining that she was field testing it for reliability and safety. After all, it would be much better for literally everyone if pro heroes didn't have to worry about their car causing civilian casualties if they had to leap into action while they were out buying groceries. Judging by the officers' reactions, it seemed like they were very invested in the idea. That left Melissa wondering if she should talk to her dad about actually releasing the self-driving car for pro hero consumption. Miss Shield, a message from Miss Hatsum. Ah well, problems for later. Read message. The digital voice keeping a polished, British accent, even while speaking Japanese, obliged promptly. I've got permission from Nezu. You're clear to enter campus once you arrive. Would you like to reply? Blue eyes glinted with determination. Yes, very well. What would you like your message to say? I'm on my way. With any luck, she'd be by Izu's side within the hour. Kyoyuka looked into Izuku's eyes, and her heart ached. Hadn't he suffered enough yesterday? Although a part of her wasn't surprised. While she didn't know him as well as she would have liked, she had still seen and experienced what he was going through enough that she should have been able to predict this after the emotional roller coaster the past 24 hours had been. Izuku was tired, but not the normal kind of tired where sleep by itself would actually help. He was the kind of tired where the emotions were drained, leaving him exhausted, while having just woken up, and, knowing Izuku's workout routine, wired and feeling almost compelled to just move and do things. As such, still at least partially asleep, Kyoyuka threw herself at the boy, clinging to him tightly, her Jax DD over his shoulders before linking together loosely behind him as she nuzzled into the side of his neck. Morning, love. She half mumbled, half groaned into his shoulder. Izuku looked down at the normally gruff punk rocker with some mild bemusement. So, sleepy Kyoyuka's affectionate, then. Although, I suppose it could explain her general irritability and brusque mannerisms if she's worried about maintaining her image. He huffed a quiet, amused laugh, vaguely aware that he normally would be a furred blushing mess, mostly due to the vague stirrings of anxiety and embarrassment writhing in the background. For now though, I suppose this is just one more thing to treasure about waking up early. Externally he repeated his question, deciding that drawing her attention to the slip would be unwise. So, is that a yes to pancakes? He relished in seeing her cute blushing face and pout, only to be pleasantly surprised by her response. And coffee, but only if you let Toru and I help, love. As she said that, one of her jacks reached back around from where they rested and tapped him playfully on the tip of his nose. Blinking rapidly he chuckled, shaking his head in amusement. All right, Kyo, if that's what you girls want. After all, if Kyoyuka wanted to be domestic for a bit longer, who was he to deny her? Toru smiled to herself as she watched Kyoyuka be affectionate with Izuku, silently happy for the girl for finally being able to express herself to the boy who she'd been pining for since before Toru even knew her. Seeing Izuku's curious glance at her, she shook herself out of her stupor, and responding in the affirmative she skipped to the coffee maker and brewed Kyoyuka a mug. While she enjoyed seeing the girl being more true to herself, she knew that it would be counterproductive to prolong the girl's later suffering in any obvious way. Once the coffee was done, Toru passed the mug to the groggy girl as Izuku extricated himself gently, going to dig up some aprons for the two of them. As she watched their shared boyfriend shuffling about the kitchen from the corner of her eye, Toru decided that it wouldn't hurt to ask the question at the forefront of her mind. So, how bad do you think you're going to take calling Izuku love when the coffee kicks in? Looking at her in an unamused fashion, the musician slowly drained the mug without breaking eye contact, before responding. I'm probably going to be embarrassed for sure. Acting all soft and lovey-dovey definitely clashes with my image. She raised a finger holding off any questions. But if it means that Green knows I meant it when I confessed to him, my image can go to hell. Ah, she was definitely starting to wake up. Gesturing at Izuku's back as he crouched down, carefully searching in a way that was both thorough, but also didn't disturb or displace any of the cabinet's contents. And, as you may have noticed, he's not exactly himself right now. The invisible girl hummed in agreement, as she watched him move, marveling at the practiced ease he carried out the task. Yeah, I don't think I've seen his eyes like that since that time Aizawa pulled that triple blind scenario after making us hike a kilometer into the mountains. She shivered, recalling that disaster. I don't think I've ever seen Izuku and Bakugo more in sync than when they found out that Izuku's mom being in danger was just a logical ruse on Aizawa's part. Kayuka winced as she recalled that lesson. I hear they're naming that crack in the mountain Aizawa's folly. Both girls jumped when they heard Izuku call over his shoulder as he moved to the closet in the corner of the kitchen. Aizawa deserved what he got. No one uses my loved one's safety as motivation. Even though the venom dripping from the last word was concerning, to say the least. Both girls couldn't help but melt a little at the implication of what was said. Coughing into her fist, as she realized she hadn't been as quiet as she'd previously thought, Kayuka turned back to Toru to continue the conversation, lowering her voice a bit so only the invisible girl could hear her. So, yeah, Green's emotionally drained. So, expect him to be blunter than usual. Toru nodded in understanding right as Izuku jumped in the air, cheering in a low voice in an attempt to not wake up the other girls. I've found them. Turning around, Izuku presented 2 aprons, each of them with the hero name of the respective girl tastefully stylized. Toru took hers in gentle hands and inspected it carefully, noting how the lettering for the kanji that spelled out Invisible Girl shimmered similarly to her outline just before her newest ultimate move. Glancing over, she saw Kayuka going beet red as she looked at what could be seen as her first piece of hero merch. A fist raised making the devil horns hand sign on a deep violet background, with jagged lines of lighter purple resembling a heartbeat on a monitor. In black lettering stylized to look like wristbands, in English font were the words earphone jack. Nezu's trying really strong to butter Green up, isn't he? The flabbergasted punk rocker said. Toru could only nod as she fought down her fit of giggles. Not wanting to waste any more time, both girls threw on their aprons and took up their places on either side of Izuku. Things proceeded like that for a while, all 3 working seamlessly, making enough pancakes of varying types to feed all of the sleeping girls as well as themselves in companionable silence. All 3 reveled in the level of cooperation that their hero training up till that point in time allowed. That continued until, as they were plating the last of the pancakes, Izuku decided to speak again. So, what did my mom want to talk with you girls about? Toru's mind screeched to a halt. Absently she noted how, like her, Kayuka froze in place, before sighing and turning towards him. Let's wait until everyone is awake to have that conversation. Okay. Seeing how uncomfortable both girls were, Izuku just nodded, before he washed his hands and went to gently wake the others up for breakfast. Tucking the towel he had been using to dry his hands in his back pocket, Izuku made his way to where the girls were sleeping. Rounding the corner he smiled, seeing Mina blearily looking around from the middle of the cuddle pile, sniffing the air even as she rubbed the sleep out of her eyes. Her investigation halted once her eyes met his own. Be fast, she slurred groggily, followed by a small yawn that Izuku privately found absolutely adorable. Chuckling softly as he approached he said, That's right Mina, Kaio, Toru and I made pancakes. Want some? Mina sleepily nodded her head as Ochako stirred and groaned. Pancakes? The brunette asked as she stretched herself awake. Smiling fondly at his best friend and first crush, Izuku responded softly to avoid rousing the others too roughly. That's right, sweetheart, we even made some matcha pancakes. No sooner had he said matcha pancakes than a brown-haired blur rocketed past him shouting dibs. This of course had the unintended consequence of rapidly waking all of the other girls in short order. Takage sat up quickly, looking absolutely lost. Chax, what the FCK? She cried at the gravity thief's back. The only response she got as Ochako rounded the corner was, seemingly, justification enough. DK, made pancakes. Oh, sorry Kayuka. Heh. No sooner had that declaration been made than a veritable wave of girls crashed off the bed and around Izuku with cries and squeals of delight and consternation as they each raced to the table with cries of Izuku's back. And is he okay? And lastly pancakes. Left behind, unscathed but slightly baffled, Izuku looked back to the bed, seeing a still, somehow, partially asleep Mina looking at him with her arms raised towards him. Carry me, she asked, looking up at him through her partially lidded eyes. A devastating tactic when done intentionally, rendered even more powerful by the accidental nature of the maneuver. Izuku chuckled even as he stepped towards her, vaguely aware of the blush rising on his face and the rapid beating of his heart. You want me to carry you to breakfast? He asked playfully. Mina, still drowsy, nodded fervently, the action seemingly rousing her slightly. I want to cuddle, she said, wiggling her arms. Shaking his head in amusement, Izuku moved over and scooped her up. As she settled into his arms, the pinkette nuzzled into his collarbone and, as she started drifting off again, murmured, You're the best, Zuzu. Love you. Izuku's heart skipped a bit at the unexpected nature of the words, only to swell in happiness when what was said registered properly. Smiling down at her, he gently carried her to the table, setting her in a free chair, before bringing her a plate of natto pancakes. Tamura leaned back in his chair, massaging his eyes. As he uncovered them, he was slightly surprised to see a steaming mug being offered from behind. Taking the proffered hot drink, he grimaced. "Why'd you give me this herbal sit?" A deep, rich voice, dripping with stern disapproval, responded. "Because you need sleep, not caffeine." Then, taking a gentler tone as a bed appeared from a portal. "Rest, Tamura. The evidence will be here in the morning." Grunting, Tamura drained the mug. Grimacing again, Lavender Kirigiri was serious this time. While it wouldn't force him to sleep, Kirigiri only served him lavender when he was particularly miffed about Tamura's sleeping habits. All right. The young leader relented. Climbing into bed, he was quickly asleep with the last mutter of, "Diamen griefer." The misty man looked over the files scattered across the desk. The computer screen paused on another playthrough of the footage that caused the League to rampage through the Aldera schools. His eyes focused on a certain unkempt man with an absurdly long scarf. Eraserhead, Kirigiri murmured to himself. And, unnoticed but not inconsequential, some of the black-purple mist at the edges of his head briefly turned light blue. Turning back to Tamura before disappearing, he pulled a blanket over his charge's shoulder. "I hope you're prepared, Tamura. The road you're walking is going to be rockier than ever before." As he faded away, returning to his own quarters, he chuckled. "Though at least it won't be boring." Emi Fukukado, otherwise known as Ms. Joke, was a few things, but mostly right now at least she was tired. She had come to UA to try and mess with Eraserhead the way that Nezu had asked her to. She honestly wasn't sure anymore why she still carried a torch for the man. But she did. Okay, that wasn't true. She knew why she carried a torch for him before today, she just wasn't sure if she would after today. Not that that was something she could actually just decide to stop on her own. She was brought out of her musings by the sound of CLC King heels and softly clinking metal that heralded the presence of Nimuri. Looking up, she saw that only a few people were still in the meeting room, the others returning to prepare for the remainder of their classes to relieve Ectoplasm's clones from substitute duty, as well as covering him so the poor man could get some sleep of his own. She slumped down, letting her face rest on her arm, sighing dramatically, years of habits causing her to turn even her own distress into a comedy routine before looking up at her friend and co-worker. "Nimuri, what will I do?" she whined pitifully. Nimuri chuckled ruefully as she sat down in the seat that had been vacated by Eraser. "About slapping Shota, or your feelings for him?" Emi raised her hands after letting go of the mug of coffee and grabbed her face as she groaned in frustration. Both. Hisashi, having walked up to them, placed a hand on her shoulder comfortingly as he sat next to her. Nimuri, nodding in acknowledgement of their other friend, took on a thoughtful expression. "I understand, it was easy to be angry with him in the moment, but then you realize that, like us, he didn't know about Midoriya's quirk only showing up at the end of the exams. Meanwhile, you also don't want to excuse his behavior because you can't help how many other Midoriyas he threw out in his time here." The green-haired woman sighed as she grabbed her mug, sipping on it before responding. "Exactly. While I know that his snap judgments are useful when dealing with villains on the streets, he has to know that logically he needs to take a different approach with kids. At the same time, I should have known he didn't understand that based on how he used the same snap judgments in his basic social interactions. Hell, it was my irritation with his snap judgment of me that started me chasing him." Looking up, she saw Nem's raised eyebrow and elaborated. "We met on a drug bust. I was assigned as his backup. This was back during his early brooding I work alone phase. And he immediately dismissed me vocally as a frivolous fool who only liked to play around on the job." Emi's brow furrowed with irritation as she stared down at her mug as she continued. "Naturally I was offended, and so I decided to bump into him on patrol, and work with him on investigations starting earlier in the process so he could see I took this gig as seriously as any other hero out there." She took another sip of coffee, letting the familiar warmth help her relax even as she started to wake up from the caffeine. Nimuri hummed again before responding. "And that's when you accidentally started to fall for him." She nodded, continuing. "It wasn't just we spent time together, and due to the fairly isolated nature of our jobs I started to develop feelings for the only guy I interacted with. It was more than that. While he brushes it off, I am telling the truth when I tell people who ask why I am chasing him. He saved me, and I saved him. Rinse and repeat for a couple of years, and with our witty banter, and voila." She gestures with free hand. The wheelchair guy rolled up, taking off his helmet, revealing himself to be Tensei. "Let me guess, the rest is history, right?" He chuckled, clearly taking pleasure at their shock. "That costume was different." Sashi shot him an accusing glare that lacked any real hate. "That was you under the mask. Why didn't you say hi, man? And where'd you get the suit?" Tensei chuckled again. "I didn't say hi because I only got here right before the meeting started. And I got this suit as a gift from David Shield, apparently as a favor to Midoriya for saving him during the Island incident." Emi let her forehead slam into the table, keeping her drink steady as she groaned. "And that just makes what Eraser said about the kid even worse. What am I supposed to do?" Nem rubbed her arm gently. "I think you do the only thing you can right now, hun. You take it a day at a time, see if you still feel the same way, or see if show changes after this enough to make it worth keeping up the chase. Sashi sighed, leaning back. I just hope the little listener is doing okay. At the questioning glances he grimaced. I noticed that whenever he was asked questions in the video his face would go blank. It was pretty clear he wasn't answering those questions willingly. Emmy and the other two all flinched at that. They were so caught up in what was said that they hadn't even noticed how the information was getting dragged out of the boy. Tensei was the first to rally at that. That just means we gotta be there for him from now on. Emmy and Nem both nodded at that. After a moment the three old friends joined together by years of teasing Eraser shifted to other, lighter topics while they finished their drinks before returning to work. Nezu sipped his tea, looking pensively at the monitor as he absorbed the information that Hound Dog had given him. Signs of psychological abuse and Quirk-backed manipulation, something he had suspected in this case. Though he had suspected it only for Midoriya, he had believed evidently wrongly that young Bakugo had been at worst enabling, followed by blackmail only at the end. But it appeared that Bakugo had been exposed to extensive conditioning and extremely invasive Quirk-based manipulation. If any of the culprits were still around, Nezu would find them, and their final days would be unpleasant. Sighing, he set the teacup down as he turned his attention to the monitor showing young Bakugo in his cell. It seemed that even incarcerated he didn't give up on his physical fitness routine. Had it been anyone else he would have found the dedication commendable. Are you suggesting that we lighten his sentence? He grimaced at the barely contained hostility in his voice. While he was willing to forgive himself his anger, he was not willing to forgive the lapse in control that made it so obvious to others. Out of the corner of his eye he saw Inui-san shake his head. No, not only would that do nothing for the almost shattered trust classes 1A and B have in us, but it would do nothing to actually address the underlying issues Bakugo has that made him as vulnerable as he was to the manipulations. No, I am merely stating the facts. And the facts are as follows. First, he has shown behavioral improvement even if negligible since arriving at UA. Second, he is a victim of his school as well. Third, 1 month won't be enough for the boy's treatment. No, I recommend he is removed from the hero course and the general student body for the rest of the year at the very least. Nezu hummed as he turned back to the counselor. And the other plan for disciplinary action. Hound Dog hummed in thought. I think we should allow him to face Knuckleduster without the Quirk suppression cuffs for their first session. It would do well to thoroughly disabuse him of his opinions of Quirk's superiority, as soon as possible. As for his punitive training with Endeavor and the Wildcats, leave the suppressors on. And you aren't worried about possible reactions should word of his treatment get out. Another shake of the muzzled head. No, there will be no one out there to witness it. Secondly, before we begin corporal punishment we will get permission from his parents after they sign a QENDA, of course. Unless they are just as bad as that school, they will agree that it is beyond time for their child to be taught that he isn't anything special. And the promise of the possibility of re-entry into the hero course in such a short PRD of time considering his infractions. Nezu giggled a bit. My, Inui-san. I didn't think you were quite so brutal. Hound Dog just shrugged. I'm actually being lenient with my suggestions right now, all things considered. Besides, any possibility of him having a prayer of rejoining the hero course will be contingent on him passing the remedial course for the provisional license. And he'll be going through corrective therapy regardless of if he passes or fails. Nezu nodded. Of course. Now, let's turn to brighter topics before our wrath causes us to overdo it with planning his treatment plan. Hey twice. Yeah, Dabai. Divided by leave us alone Scarface. What do you think Nezu's going to do about that Bakugo brat? That's a good question, I'm not sure. Divided by I hope they sick stain on him. Dabai just laughed as he sipped his iced coffee. He missed when he could drink the hot variety. That would be a hell of a show for sure. Melissa strode into the support department labs, carrying 2 cups of coffee from May's favorite shop. May, I'm here. May turned around a smile and a greeting on her lips before she saw the offering. Hey Mel coffee. As the pink-haired blur zipped over to her before stopping, hands hovering uncertainly over both cups, a question in her eyes as she looked up at the older girl. Melissa chuckled and handed May her cup. Here you go, May. Coffee. May cried out as she snatched the cup before trying to down it all at once before coughing and spluttering. After a moment she seemed to remember herself. Sorry Mel, how was the trip? No sooner had Izuku sat down and plated his own brunch than Kyoyuka had cleared her throat. Alright girls, Izuku asked me an important question. One I thought we should all be here for. Hearing her words, Izuku couldn't help but feel a faint stirring of a familiar tight feeling forming in his chest. Seeming to sense his unease, Mina and Sue put comforting hands on his shoulders. Looking around the table, Kyoyuka joined in, one of her jacks extending under the table to wrap gently around one of his wrists, and trace gentle circles on the back of his hand as she continued. He wanted to know what his mom wanted to speak with us last night, Izuku couldn't help but notice all of the girls at the table tensing, and while a part of him was confused why the 1B girls tensed as well, he started to feel the anxiety start to climb further. This is it, Mom said something that. However, his spiral was prevented when Take's floating finger tapped him on the tip of his nose. None of that now, Big Green, she said softly from her seat across the table next to Itsuka. Nodding in gratitude to the verdette, Izuku turned his attention to Kyoyuka, seeing her smile gently at him. We're here for you. Her face took on a red hue as she finished the sentence. Love. Visibly gathering herself as Mina and Take grinned smugly at her, she continued. Izuku, what your mother wanted to say to us was something difficult, but it was something we needed to hear. She paused and looked into his eyes, and Izuku's heart nearly broke, seeing familiar uncertainty and fear in them. Looking around, he saw similar fear in the eyes of each girl at the table, and a familiar, protective burning heat built up in his chest, and pressure in his temples. She said that you might not have felt like you could have said no when we all confessed to you, and that because of that, a healthy relationship was probably impossible. The feeling only grew as he saw her eyes start to water, and her voice began to shake, before she aggressively wiped her eyes and cleared her throat. So, we all wanted to make sure you understand that you do have a say here. Thought that you could, she bit her lip. You could say no to this. You could break up with us. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment. When she opened them up again, Izuku's breath was taken away by the fiery determination, as well as something unfamiliar, but that he hoped was affection, maybe even love. We'll understand, because. At this point all of the girls at the table joined in, and in such perfect harmony it almost seemed practiced. Izuku, you matter too.